All right, well, we are ready to start the meeting here. The Joint Committee looking at the tax credits around the state, one of our meetings we've had in several locations now. I'm Chuck Hustetler, I chair the Finance Committee. My co-chair, and we sort of alternate on who leads the meeting, is Shaw Blackman here, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and we're excited to be here. Before we get started, I know we're going to have the Columbus State University president start off the meeting, but first we do want to do an invocation, and I thought it would be appropriate if the Dean of the Senate, who started in 1993, I was living in California at the time, but the Dean of the Senate, who was came in as chairman, I believe, of Veterans Affairs and Home Security, was at the original and chairs now, and he has been a great friend as well over there. If you could come do the invocation for us, we would appreciate it. Ed Harbison, of course, everybody knows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. If you would bow with me, invoke the presence of God into our meeting. Thank you, Father God, for delivering us safely to this destination. Let us have great contemplating hearts to be fair, to be honest, and most of all, to be dedicated to the proposition that we can make Georgia the greatest state in the nation. Bless us as we travel back and forth. Bless our family, the sick and shut in, and the people who wanted to be here but could not. Let us always be judicious and remember that God is sitting on the throne and he blesses us mighty every day. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here in your district. Our Columbus State University president now, Stuart Rayfield, if you want to, I think you can get the mic over there from them.
Well, good morning, everyone. All right. Well, good morning. I'm Ron Williams, Chief of Staff here at Columbus State University, and on behalf of the students, faculty, and staff, I welcome the Joint Tax Credit Review Panel and other guests to our campus. I greet you on behalf of our president, Dr. Stuart Rayfield, who was unable to be here with us this morning as she is dealing with back problems. We thank you for choosing our campus for the important work that you will be conducting on today. While you are assembled here, I wanted to take this brief opportunity to share some of the exciting things that are occurring here at Columbus State University. Partnerships are vital here at Columbus State, and it makes our university unique. They fuel our arts, community, and outreach programs, and they make a difference in the quality of our students' learning and their experiences. Through our traditional and one-year Nexus degree programs in cybersecurity, our students are networking with industry experts and leaders as part of their studies, and many are offered jobs before they even complete their degrees. The state's burgeoning entertainment industry is driving the film sector in Columbus. It's also opening doors for our students who are pursuing both traditional and Nexus degrees in film production. Thanks in large part to our partnerships with the Georgia Film Academy and Flat Rock Studios here in Columbus. Since its inception in 2019, enrollment in our undergraduate robotics engineering program has grown tenfold. Research partnerships with industry and military greatly benefit our students' academic experiences. The newer master's degree program recently celebrated its first 6 graduates who have gone on to doctoral studies and to private sector careers. Each is combining what they have learned at Columbus State with the latest solutions in AI technology, healthcare, defense, cybersecurity, aviation, and computing technology. Education and healthcare are cornerstones of any community's quality of life, and our students and graduates are crucial to the quality of both here in the Chattahoochee Valley. Our partnership with the Muskogee County School District has guaranteed employment contracts for all of our qualified teacher education graduates. Today, more than half of the Muskogee County system's educators and administrators are graduates of Columbus State University. Our students are working alongside them as they prepare for this all-important career field. Throughout our academic colleges, our faculty, programs, and outreach centers, they all actively partner with the school district to enrich the K-12 education from the arts to STEM and everything in between. Partnerships are also at the heart of equipping our nursing students to serve the healthcare needs of this community and beyond. Those include new privately funded simulation labs in our School of Nursing, academic partnerships with Columbus Technical College's nursing program, and workforce connections with the St. Francis Emory Healthcare and Piedmont Regional. Our workforce development partners are equally important to us achieving our academic goals. Here in our backyard, We have some of the state's, the nation's, and the world's premier employers who have told us one thing: communication, critical thinking, problem solving, and conflict resolution are invaluable skills in today's marketplace. That's why across all of our programs, we are leaving the term soft skills behind in favor of the more appropriate career competencies. Our graduates will hone through a stronger core curriculum combined with what they learn in their disciplines of specialty. Through your leadership roles, you too are important partners in what we do here at Columbus State University and across the state of Georgia in the higher education landscape. Again, on behalf of the entire university, I thank you for the vital work that you're doing as a part of this committee and on behalf of our state. We're here to serve you in whatever way we may be helpful. Please let us know. Again, thanks so much for being on our campus today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting us here. We want to, at this time, introduce the panel members that are here. We've got some on Zoom watching the panel as well. And I know Senator Redd out of Cobb County, I think, was running a few minutes late and should be here any minute. But as I said before, I'm Chuck Hufstetler. I chair the Finance Committee. I'm out of Rome, Georgia.
John Albers, represent North Fulton, Cobb, and Cherokee County, and I'm honored to be the vice chair for Senator Hufstetler.
Representative Carpenter, you want to work back?
Representative Carpenter, District 4, Dalton, Georgia, Northwest Georgia.
I'm Bruce Williams, and I represent Walton County.
I'm Matt Hatchett. I'm from Dublin, represent District 155 that covers all of Johnson and all of Lawrence County, and I chair the House Appropriations Committee.
I'm Debbie Buckner, and I'm proud to represent part of Columbus. Welcome to my hometown. I'm glad that each and every one of you are here today. I also want to, I know you probably were going to do this, but I would feel very awkward not recognizing my colleagues that are here. Representative Richard Smith, Chair of Rules. Representative Vance Smith And Representative Sands is not in our delegation, but I'm glad to see you here. I do want to just take a minute to say that I'm very grateful that the committee and Senator Ed Harbison, my senator, excuse me, I was doing House members and I didn't mean to leave you out, but you were already introduced. But I'm very glad that the committee chose to come to Columbus. I think I've always been proud of my hometown and the fact that we work together collaboratively. We have been a user of a variety of different tax credits that have helped our community save cultural, historical structures and adapt them for new uses that have been able to help our community grow, thrive, and create opportunities for our citizens. So I'm very grateful that y'all came to Columbus, and thank you all for being here as well.
And it's good to be here. Thank you for acknowledging our colleagues here. Glad to have them. Appreciate Columbus. Appreciate you hosting us. Columbus State University, thank you for having us. And as we kind of near the end of this journey, I did want to say to my fellow chairman here that it has been an honor serving and on this panel with you and chairing it, and appreciate all your hard work. So thank you, and we'll get started.
All right, at this point, we're going to turn the program over to Philip Gilman from DCA.
While we're pulling that up, good morning. My name is Philip Gelman. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Housing Assistance and Development at DCA. I'd like to extend a thanks to the university for hosting us, and of course, as I go through my panel, Mr. Mayor, thank you for having us in your city as well. So today I'll be talking about the work that the Georgia Department of Community Affairs does to house Georgia's workforce. Specifically, we've got a panel to talk about the state housing tax credit. I'd like to quickly do some introductions, of course, because they're going to sit up here while I give about a 10-minute primer But again, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We got Mayor Skip Henderson here from the city of Columbus. We've got Kathy Williamson, who, whether or not she liked it or not, we temporarily gave her a promotion as GDOT Commissioner, but she's the president and CEO of NeighborWorks Columbus. We've also got Bill Gross, who's the president of WH Gross Corporation, and they are a developer and they develop and construct affordable housing through this program. And we have Chris Height, who's the president of Sugar Creek Capital, who are major investors both in Georgia and nationwide in this program. So I'm going to jump in and talk about, well, I should pause for a second and also thank the chairs and the co-chairs. Thank you for having us here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about our program. So I'll jump in on the housing credits. I like to start most presentations with some photos, right? And to be able to show what this program can do. Lots of folks, when they think about affordable housing, have an image in their mind. And it may look like this, it may look like something else. So this is a 3-story garden-style apartment, but we have a lot of flexibility in the program to build that form of rental housing, as well as more single-family or duplex style, and most everything in between. We also have the ability to do adaptive reuse work. And as you can see here, this is an image of a school that was beginning to be a blight on its community. And this program has also the ability to come in and transform a school like Ramona Riley from this into this, and change from a potential blight to an anchor in the community. So of course, 10 minutes. So I'll give a high level overview and touch on a few of the highlight points, what the program is, what it does. So public policy objective is to create and rehabilitate affordable rental housing. And of course, we can talk about what affordable means, but in most communities, whereas the market rent we're seeing these days can get as high as $1,800, $2,000, and north of that for rent for a family, let's say of a 2-bedroom, our rents might be more in the range of $1,000, $1,200, maybe in some rural areas as low as $800 a month. So this isn't a no rent program, and it's not a subsidy program. It's rent that is set at levels that are affordable to certain income levels. So from an agency perspective, we appreciate this program because it's efficient. We already have a federal tax credit program that we built an entire infrastructure for. So I have a full team, some of them are here today. I've got a full team that already administers the federal program. We already oversee the competitive applications, we already oversee the construction process, and we oversee the 30-year compliance period. So by having a side-by-side mirrored state credit, we're able to use that exact same infrastructure and not add to the administrative burden for the state. It's an effective program from an agency perspective for 2 reasons. It's a pay-for-performance program, and it's a public-private partnership. So what do I mean by those 2 things? Pay for performance. So not a dollar of state money goes at risk or is spent until these properties are actually built and folks are moving in. So if I was using a loan product, I would be lending that money out to build an apartment complex, and the state money would go out at the time I lend it. And we would be taking on all of that construction and development risk as the state. Because it's structured as a tax credit that turns into equity, private equity investors are actually the ones providing the capital and taking on all of that construction and lease-up risk. And so their investors aren't able to receive any money until that property is complete and folks are moving in. That's when the spigot turns on, if you will. So that's the pay-for-performance aspect. It's also a public-private partnership. So this program dates back to the Reagan era, 1986. The federal program was created as sort of an alternative to public housing or direct rent payments. So this isn't government developed, it's not government run. What we do is provide competitive allocations for private and nonprofit developers to build the housing, for private and nonprofit owners to manage the housing, and they're working with private banks and private and actually in some cases nonprofit investors, all of whom have a financial incentive to make sure that this program continues to be effective and that the properties stay at a level of quality, because that's how they continue to see their financial outcome. And then we partner as the state because we make sure that the applications are high quality. We get 2 to 3 times as many applications as we have funding. So we're able to really select the ones with the best real estate fundamentals and the ones that meet the policy priorities of the state. And then we're able to oversee the construction and compliance to make sure that these properties stay in quality shape. I won't dive into this map because we should have some opportunity to talk about it with the panel, but But it is worth noting about 27 states around the country at this point have some form of a state housing tax credit. I won't have time to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I'll tell you why I have it on here. It's a good reminder of who we house. So you can see a lot of icons on there that I imagine you'll recognize. So I talked earlier about what is affordable. And so the rents that we charge are designed to be affordable based off where a family lives. In Columbus, that can be as high as for a family of 4, that can be as high as $57,000 a year in household income. If we drive up the road to Warner Robins, that goes as high as $70,000 a year. So you can see here some of the major economic components of our workforce, industries in our workforce. And when you think about 57,000 or 70,000, depending on what region of the state you're in, you can really see how much of our workforce we capture, whether or not it's retail, food service, childcare, senior care, and many, many things in between. So I've also been asked to try to give a primer and explain how this program is structured, how it functions. So what I've laid out here is 3 capital stacks, right? 3 ways you can fund a development. On the far left is a conventional product. So if you've ever bought a home, if you're fortunate these days to have bought a home, what you've done is you bring in an equity down payment, right? And that may be 20% traditionally. And then the bank looks at your income and sizes the mortgage they're willing to give you. Very similar in the multifamily real estate market on the conventional side. So their equity investors and owners are going to come in and provide an equity down payment, and they're going to charge, let's say, $2,000 in rent. Well, it costs about $600 to operate that unit. So they're going to use that delta, that $1,400 of net income. They're going to go to a bank and see how much they can borrow up front to build their property. And a bank in this case may lend them enough here on the left to cover the remaining 80% of their capital stack. So you heard the rents that I talked about earlier. If instead of charging $2,000, we're charging $1,200, it still costs $600 to operate that unit. So when you go to the bank and say, all right, well, now I'm only making $600 of net income, or in a more rural area, if the rents are more like $800 or $850 and it still costs $600 to operate that unit, now you're going to the bank and saying, I'm going to net out $200. How much will you give me in a mortgage? Well, your answer is up here on the screen. So we have 2 products, one in the middle, which allows more moderate rents, either because it's in a higher rent market or it's more of a preservation deal that keeps costs down, where you're able to get about 1/3 of your costs covered by the bank in a mortgage debt. But then you have to find some other way to fund that equity gap because 20% is not going to be enough. So the federal program in this case is designed to fund another 1/3, and then they leave it to the state to figure out that final 1/3. And here in Georgia, we've figured out that final 1/3 using the state tax credit. So that's how us as an agency are able to make that middle product work. You may have heard it called the 4% credit. The final product on the right is the 9% credit. That's particularly useful in rural areas. It's useful in areas where rents are a little bit lower, because in that case, that's the lowest amount of debt a bank's going to be willing to lend onto a deal, and it's the highest amount of equity needed to make the deal work. You may have heard that called the 9% credit. So I only have about a minute left in our primer, but I wanted to touch a little bit on the tax incentive evaluation and some of the ongoing conversations that we've had around this program. So a lot of this evaluation hinged on an academic study that did a but-for analysis that said, without the state tax credit, we would have lost somewhere in the range of 21 to 25% of production. I found that a little odd personally, having worked in this program for about a decade. And so what we did is we went in and looked at our actuals, our data over 4 recent years, and we said, look, let's take away the state credit and see, let's go line by line with the remaining funds and see how much we could fund. And what we found was a 67% loss in production. So in recent years, we've been averaging about 8,000 units a year in production. That would go down from around 32,000 in 4 years to about 12,000 total. And if I were sitting in your chairs, I'd say, okay, 21 to 25% and 67 is quite a large gap. How do we get there? So I talked to you a little bit about the structure before. So the academic study did a comparative analysis, And we've already sat down with the authors of the study as recently as last week and started to talk through some concerns we have about the methodology, about how academically they could have come to that number. But when you look at the actual data from recent years, a few things happen. One, if you take that state credit away, I, or the developer, can't increase the mortgage because the only way to increase the mortgage is to increase the rents. And the rents are capped by federal statute. That's also the point of the program. So if we increase the rents, we'd lose the federal credit. So the mortgage is stuck where it is. I can't increase the federal credits as an agency because while the federal credits are capped as a pool, they're also capped per individual deal. So for the majority of our program, the 6,000 out of the 8,000 that we build every year, the feds will at most fund 30 to 40% of the costs. So if the bank's only funding a third and the feds are only funding a third, if I as a state agency lose my state funds to fund the rest, it's not that I have to do less, it's really that I almost can't do any. There are funds available around the state, soft funds, additional debt. And so that's how we did our analysis, is basically we cobbled together all the additional resources and said, what could we fund? And what really came out was only 1 in 4 deals. I imagine we'll want to discuss this analysis a little bit more, but it's probably a good segue into our panel because I know we have Chris Height, who has some additional comments on the study. So I think it might make sense to jump into a full response.
We want to probably do a few questions
Sounds
first from
great.
the members on what you talked about. And I know you didn't really get into the 4 or 9% program, the details of it, but I don't know how much everybody understands that program. But basically, you're getting that credit over a 10-year period under the 4 or 9%. And the 4% is 30% basically of your total cost that you're getting. The 9% is 70%, but it can go up, my understanding, to 39 or 91%. So with that, we also know that 20% or 40% of the units under the federal program have to be designated low income. But I think you guys have higher commitments from some people in some cases. So we can get to that. But one of the questions I have, I've seen how the program has really gone up much higher than inflation and cost over the years. If somebody is paying 91% of me to build something, what is the incentive to keep costs down? I mean, if I was building my house, for instance, and somebody said I'll pay 91%, I'd probably build a heck of a house. So what's the incentive? And is that one of the reasons these costs keep spiraling up? And another question would be, I think we were at about 295 million in that audit, and the next closest state was 115. So we're by far the most generous state. I think we're one of 7 that do 100% match. And when I'm talking about 91% or 39%, that's only the Georgia dollars. That's not the federal dollars. So it seems like a pretty generous program. It is the most generous one in the country, and is it not over generous?
So I appreciate the questions. They're good questions. And I'll try to take each one in turn, and it may be that some of the panelist members may like to address a few as well. So let's talk about cost and cost incentives. So it's our responsibility as an agency to provide cost oversight. So we have live data every year in the developments that we create and the construction oversight that we do, and we'll have several policies in place to incentivize and encourage cost containment. So, and we can dive into those. In some cases, we're requiring contractor cost analyses. So a third party to come in and look at the contractor costs, requiring a third party to come in and look at the total costs. And then we audit the costs at the end as the agency to make sure that they are all legitimate and real costs. But really, to your point, is sort of the growth over time. And I think there's something that's worth talking about in this program that's a distinction from the way most folks view market development. So if you're a market developer, you're going to come in with the intent of, I need to build this property, I need to get it cash flowing, or you need to lease it up. And after 2 or 3 years, once you show that cash flow, what you're looking for is somebody to purchase that property from you. So you're proving that this building can make money, and you turn around, usually 3 to 5 years later in a market cycle, and you sell that property. So the way this program is designed is you have to construct it and keep it affordable for at a minimum of 15, but up to 30 years. So what I like to say is, if you had somebody coming and looking at your roof after a hailstorm, and they said, you've got some damage, we can replace your roof, but you can't replace it again for 15 to 30 years. You're gonna make a larger investment upfront to ensure that that property is going to that roof, or in this case of the metaphor, that property is going to continue to be an asset to the community 15 and 30 years later. So there is some intentionality around the costs, and it's a bit of an apples and oranges comparison to the market, because whereas the market can recapitalize every 5 to 8 years, these properties have to wait 15, 16, 17, 18, and beyond years before they can do any meaningful recapitalization. So there's an intentional upfront investment so that we don't have an eyesore or dilapidated properties in our communities 15 to 20 years later. We talk about this program being generous. Did you have follow-up? Sorry, sir. Did you want me to answer your second question? Okay. So the second question was, is Georgia generous comparatively to other states? You mentioned how this program is a 10-year program, and I will acknowledge for anyone in the room that it is, and I've tried myself, it's difficult to go state by state and analyze what every single state invests, because some states have a 6-year credit, some states have a 10-year credit. But even in the study that we talked about earlier, if you go in and look at that table, most of the numbers represented are 1-year numbers. So it wasn't intentional, but they did not multiply by 6 or 10 in many cases. And so you're in the study comparing a 10-year total, the 294 that you mentioned, to 1-year investments in other states. One other thing worth noting, that a tax credit is not the only investment that a state made. So Florida passed legislation last year to invest around $711 million in loan funds for affordable housing. So there's different tools in different states. The equity tool through the tax credit is what Georgia's been using, but other states are going to use other products. And so to get a full apples to apples comparison, what we have to make sure we're doing is multiplying the full stream of value in those other states, but also look at what type of loans or trust funds or other tools that they are subsidizing or adding to the gap funding pot.
Thank you for your presentation. That's helpful. It leans on one of my questions, because in doing some of the homework prior to the meeting, it looks like out of the lower 48 states, 21 do not offer assistance. And I'm wondering, how are they making the economics work versus the others that are offering that?
So not to give an overly simplified answer to that question, but they're not in many cases. So I talked about our production. We're doing about 8,000 units a year. I think I have a slide towards the end, which I'm happy to pull up. Georgia ranks 4th in the country behind California and New York. We're right neck and neck with Texas in the production that we do as a state. So we punch above our weight because of the investment that we do, and that's a benefit to our residents because we're able to build those 8,000 units. A lot of states, because they don't have that funding source, that gap funding source, if you go look at many of those 21 states around the country that have no type of subsidy, typically all they're building are 9% developments. So if we were in their shoes, we would build the 2,000 or so 9% units that we build every year. We wouldn't be in a position to build the 6,000 4% units. And you can see that pretty commonly in states that don't have any type of gap funding source.
Thank you.
I think we probably have a couple, but I will, save. I think we can hang on to ours until everybody's had a chance to. It may or may not fit better into the flow of things. So,
I appreciate it. So what I'll do is transition to our panel. I've already had a chance to briefly introduce them, but while we're on the topic of the tax evaluation study, I was going to give Chris Height a chance to respond because I know you had specific comments on the study.
Sure. My name is Chris Height. I'm CEO of Sugar Creek Capital, and we're an investor in tax credit projects across the country. We employ 10 people in Atlanta, Georgia, and we've invested in about 100 Georgia projects since 2010. I sent you all a little memo, not little, it's 3-pagers. You may not have seen it, but I think you've got a copy handy. If you wouldn't mind pulling that up, it's this deal right here with the Georgia Affordable Housing Coalition logo on top. And I'm here on behalf of the Georgia Affordable Housing Coalition. I should mention that. I invest in these projects, and so pay attention when I hear there's a study going on to look at this program. So I watched y'all's presentation, and I saw a PhD come up and say that only about 25% of the deals could be attributed to the state tax credit. And I looked at our portfolio of about 100 deals, and I picked the ones with the highest rents and the lowest expenses. And I said, could we have swapped out our equity for debt, and could this deal have worked? And even in the most extreme examples, which weren't that extreme, the answer was not even close. You absolutely had to have our equity to make the deal work. Our equity doesn't exist but for state tax credits. We put out money up front, project gets built, gets leased up. Only after each building is 100% occupied by qualified tenants do we receive tax credits over a 10-year period, which we sell to return our profit. And you take away our money, and none of those deals work. And I don't mean they could have worked a little smaller or worked a little less. I mean they're millions of dollars off, don't work, don't get built. You'd have to kill some of them and take the federal resources from those to lump onto others if you took our state credit away. So in our case, not a single deal out of the 100 would have worked. Not 75%, not 25%, not a single. So the but-for test in our case, but for the state credit, nothing gets built. So why did this guy say this? So I called Jet Tony, who's the lobbyist for the coalition. I said, well, what's going on? And he sends me this study. He mentions an audit. I thought it was a state audit or something done by CPAs. No, it's a study done by Georgia State. So I look at this, and I realize it's a data set comparing census tracts in Georgia with LIHTC units, that's what we call low-income housing tax credit, versus census tracts in not Georgia with LIHTC units. And it says that there's only about 25% more units in Georgia versus not Georgia. Okay, well now I see how you get there. The data they used to compare these tracts was taken from 2000 to 2009. The program passed in 2000, it was effective for projects placed in service January 1, 2000 going forward. Well, it takes a couple years to get a deal placed in service once they've received tax credits from DCA. So any deals early on couldn't have possibly counted on a state tax credit that didn't exist yet. So about 2002 is when this thing starts mattering. Now, if you look on the third page of that memo I sent you, there's a graph. There's an orange line and a blue line. The orange line is the housing production in the Georgia census tracts. The blue line's everywhere else. Look about 2002, that orange line jumps up. And this is from that study that said only about 25% more. And that's because developers could start counting on this credit. Then you'll notice it goes way down in 2007-8. Well, the reason for that is we had a global financial crisis. Companies were losing money. If you're losing money, you're not paying taxes. If you're not paying taxes, you don't care about buying tax credits. If you don't care about buying tax credits, you're not going to put money into an affordable housing deal that throws off tax credits. In fact, the federal government put out an exchange program where people could exchange their tax credits for cash. And they decided to do that in most cases. So Georgia went back to the trend that it was in before, where it was a little below the federal production for those years because the tax credit didn't matter. So the years that really mattered in that study were about 2002 to about 2007. Now, if you look there, you're running somewhere around 8 to 11,000 units in Georgia versus somewhere about 4,000 to 5,000 in the country. Well, that's more than double. And the issue is that was then and this is now. I wasn't even investing in this state at that time. The people that were doing it were typically developers working with their local banks, and they were putting in equity prices that are about a third to a half of what they are now. So your state credit now is far more efficient than it was then. Yet the whole study here in 2023 is based on data that the newest data is from 2009. I think the program is doing a heck of a job for Georgia taxpayers. I think some of your population growth is attributable to the fact that you've got affordable housing. Your population growth has been outstripping the country by about 50%. And I think a good part of that is because you've got companies expanding here and there's places for their workers to live. And I think we're a part of that solution. So I think it's a heck of a deal. I would ask you all, if you're going to rely on the study, to have the study do one thing: update your data And if you don't have time to update your data, then pick some deals. Pick 10, 12, 5, 2, I don't care, and look at each deal and see, like I did, if it works without a state credit. And I think you'll see that it doesn't work without a state credit. You could take some of those rural 9% deals, kill those, double them up, and take that money to a suburban area, add some debt to it, and you can make those 9% units work. But it'll hurt your rural deals if you do that. I think another thing that the study ought to do, and probably can't do because there's not a good tool, is to study the rent saved. Most of our residents are saving hundreds of dollars a month. That's real money for folks. They couldn't find an apartment, a new apartment. There's no chance at the rents they're paying. That's money that they can use to make a car payment, get to work, health insurance, whatever it is that they absolutely need. And there's no mention of the actual rent savings by the residents in that study. So I called Tony and said, Jet, I got to talk to somebody about this. This study can't be the basis for cutting the program because I believe the study's got some outdated data. So here I am, folks. Happy to take any questions about the study or how I make money or anything else.
Appreciate it, Chris. So I'm also moderating the panel, so I'll kind of move us through the conversation here. Got a couple slides just to help as background. What you're looking at here is a pie chart of a typical tax credit development and the different trades that are involved. So this would be a transition while we're kind of wrapping up our technical piece. Bill, I'll turn the conversation to you and give you a chance to just talk about the role that your team plays, if you don't mind talking a little bit about the folks that you employ here in Georgia as part of this program, and talk to us a little bit about the commitment and the risk that you're taking on as a housing credit developer compared to a market transaction.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you guys today, and hopefully I can give you a perspective from a tax credit developer that does not only tax credit properties, but also market rate apartments. So the question came up a while ago, well, do we get paid extra money to build these things? Quite honestly, no. It's very competitive, and so I can put on the hat of not only the contractor developer for tax credit properties, but also for market rate properties. But I'll tell you a few things that you may not realize, that a tax credit developer is personally liable for the operation, both financially and physical responsibility of each property for a minimum 15 and the extension period of 30 years. When you think about predicting the future and what things are going to come up, just like what we're having right now, the cost increases that we've had just from maintenance and management in the last 2 or 3 years, we've not been able to just increase rents to cover that. So there's risks that are embedded with being a tax credit developer. One of the things that I'd like to really highlight on today is how tax credit properties, especially in rural areas, are more than just housing. When I say that, I live down in the southeast corner of the state. I work predominantly from Savannah, in Savannah, westward a few counties, and then down to the Georgia-Florida line. And I could give you case study by case study of how the housing tax credits have been used strategically in communities to not only provide housing, but be the catalyst for some of the downtowns, some of the communities that we've worked in that they would not otherwise be able to have. Little case study here is Waycross, Georgia. We built a project about 10 years ago in Waycross that was started with a 7-story building that was vacant, had been vacant for 15 years. Occupancy in downtown Waycross was non-existent. We built that development, got the Georgia Trust award for the year for Waycross, and today there's very few vacancies downtown. There's a thriving community. It's brought life back to the downtown. So the tax credit program is more than just housing. It's economic development for a lot of communities that would not otherwise see it, both new construction and adaptive reuse. I'm passionate about this. We direct employ about 50 people, collectively through building developments, upwards of 200 people. All of them are taxpayers. All of them are adding back to the community. So the multiplier effect of building in these communities is really amplified if you really look at and see the economics of it all. Philip, what other kind of questions can I maybe address?
I think that's helpful, and maybe we'll give the mayor a chance to weigh in, and I'll circle back around.
Okay.
If I may jump in here, and this is just on us, but Mr. Mayor, I apologize. We did not give you the floor, recognize you, allow you to welcome us to your city. We appreciate you hosting us here in Columbus, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Buckner did such a terrific job. All I need to say is ditto. We're thrilled to have this committee here to be able to discuss and do business on behalf of Georgians all across the state. And a personal note of thanks to the job that you have undertaken as a committee. It's not an easy job, and I think it's absolutely a very prudent step to take to revisit, to relook, and to hopefully renew some of the tax credits that exist across the state of Georgia. Just like y'all on a much smaller level, we have to submit a balanced budget, and it's incumbent upon the legislative folks to really make sure that they're weighing everything and make sure that it all fits and it's yielding some type of return. I happen to think that this particular tax credit obviously does yield a return. I'm going to kind of speak to you from the perspective of a local elected official. I will piggyback on something Bill said. We had a very similar situation with one of our a LIHTC property that went up, and it was a bridge between some development in our downtown area, which had really been thriving. We're struggling a little bit to get some of the development moving north along the 2nd Avenue corridor, which is our main gateway into the downtown area. And we now have a beautiful building there that was, I mean, it was the units were all rented, I think, before the first brick was laid. But I think one thing I want to mention, Philip had on one of his slides, he showed some of those logos. I think it's important to recognize who some of these folks in our community are that are residents of the properties. We have folks that work with AFLAC, that work with TSIS, Global Solutions, that work with the Muskogee County School District. They work at Fort Moore. Some of them are active duty military personnel, some are civilian workers out there. Columbus Consolidated Government. We made a commitment about a year and a half ago when we were trying to do a comprehensive pay study that our lowest paid employee, full-time employee, would not make less than $15 an hour. Well, that's $31,000 a year. That means their affordability of the homes that or the housing they can access is about $780. The average rental for a 2-bedroom unit in Columbus right now, this is the average, not loaded with amenities, is about $1,030 or $1,040. So there's almost a $300 gap between what an employee of our own government, after raising their pay, is able to access. And those are the individuals that end up in a stress situation where they're trying to stretch their income to try to cover housing costs that are getting harder and harder for them to keep up with. Our agency under the United Way, Home for Good, which focuses on homelessness, they also provide bridge assistance for people who are one paycheck, missed paycheck away from homelessness. And in January, we were receiving about 30 of those calls. Here we are in October, and we're getting about 65 to 70 of those calls, trying to keep from being evicted. But we have, our housing authority has thousands of people on a wait list for properties, thousands. Plus, we've got about 920 tenant-based vouchers that are going unused. There's no place in Columbus where they can use those to cover the cost of their housing. You know, these guys are the numbers guys, but I will admit to talking to Kathy Williams. She's my go-to guru for all things housing in Columbus. We were talking about a study that the University of Georgia conducted on a return on the investment for the LIHTC. And I think it said for every $1 invested, there was about $5.80 that in economic activity that was generated. I also look at the soft dollar return, though. Anybody that's worked on the local level of government, and I've been in one form or another, been doing this for 27 years. I've been mayor for 5 years, but I served on our city council in an at-large position for 22 years prior to that. You get a street level view of some of the neighborhoods and individuals that you're trying to extricate from this impoverished condition that they find themselves in. And it starts with housing. It does. First thing I did when I became mayor was we put $1 million into a budget that had only been getting about $50,000 a year, and that is to demolish some blighted properties that were holding back the development of the individuals that lived in some of these neighborhoods. So we understand that housing, that continuum, that housing is right in the center of, that if they're living in substandard housing, they're going to end up finding it more difficult to get out of those impoverished areas. They're going to have a tougher time accessing health care. They're going to have a tougher time with food insecurity, a tougher time with transportation access. And ultimately, they're going to end up, many of them end up in a situation where they turn to into criminal activities. And we've seen a lot of our crime figures, violent crime, go up. And I'm convinced that it's all part of that. So the more we focus our efforts, and we do the but-for as well. If we had not been able, we put about 19, over 10 years, we put about 19 tax credit properties in service, and I think about 825 units, somewhere around there. And if not for that, we would have even longer waiting lists, people who are unable to try to access a quality place. I mean, we've got an inventory issue, but really we've got a quality issue. I also mentioned I'm fortunate enough to be the new chair for the Revenue and Finance Committee for our policy committee for Georgia Municipal Association. And it gives me an opportunity to talk with elected officials, as y'all do, all across the state. And everybody's singing off the same sheet of music. I mean, we're all struggling to identify tools that will allow us to provide quality, affordable housing for our residents. And yeah, so anytime we get an opportunity to advocate for retaining some of those tools, we do so. So thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Kathy, I'd love for you to weigh in here. You've certainly seen this region's growth and the response and the need for response over the last couple decades. If you could give your perspective on the community impact.
So I represent the nonprofit LIHTC development field. And in Columbus, I'll mention that there are 3 affordable housing developers, 3, and we're all nonprofit. We have the Housing Authority, Habitat for Humanity, and NeighborWorks Columbus. And let's be honest, growth is inevitable, right? It's created in the boardroom and in the bedroom. And we love robust job activity. And for the most part, right, for the most part, we want to raise our children in a community that's thriving, and we want them to what? To come back to that community and raise their families. But more often than not, they can't afford the community that they were raised in. We as a country, this is not exclusive to Georgia, right? We as a country have not kept up with the growth, just the growth of our population. We are 4 to 6 million units short in the country. In Columbus, if you look at the study that was done just before COVID hit, the Federal Reserve Atlanta did a deep dive on the rental affordability and availability in the Southeast. Columbus was one of the data points. It's an excellent study. In Columbus, in Muskogee County, the gap between what is affordable and what is available to our citizens making that median income or less is in excess of 16,000 units. 16,000 families are either living in more house than they can afford, doubled and tripled up, traditional homeless families living in shelters in their cars, or doing whatever they can, sometimes living in substandard housing. When you're housing vulnerable, when you're paying more than you can afford to live in a unit,
it creates toxic stress. And the first casualty of toxic stress in a community and a family is caring. It's caring about each other, caring about your community, caring about each other. The mayor suggested the monetary return on this investment. These credits are investments. There is a social return as well. He alluded to the crime rate. Having served on our school board for 14 years, I know that low-income housing is critical to the success and the educational attainment of our children. For our children to be able to stay in one home is so important. But when you're paying more than you can afford, you're often one step ahead of the landlord, and you're bundling up your kids in the middle of the night before the eviction notice the next day. It does lead to crime. It does lead to truancy. So it is in our social interest as a collective to make sure our people are cared for. We want Georgia to be the #1 state to do business in. It is becoming an absolute economic engine for jobs. But every one of those jobs needs a place to live, a way to get to work, and a place to adequately educate their children. That is what companies are looking at more and more to determine if a community and a state really cares about our people. We want to be a great state. I will submit to you, before we can be a great state, we have to be a good state. And the only way we can be a good state is to ensure that all of our people, those who live here now and those that we are attracting and saying come, have a safe, decent, affordable place to live. The tax credit program is critical to that success, critical. You've heard some of the hard numbers from the investors and the users. We have about 500 units. Every single one of them is rented or sold before it's completed. And every single apartment that we have has a waiting list, extensive. I get calls every week from the people that have already been discussed, that have vouchers, that have a $1,000 voucher, $1,100 voucher, and they say there's nothing. There's nothing vacant. There's nothing available. And that is with tax credit projects here in Columbus, but not enough. We're still short. We need this desperately for our people. I would say to you, we don't need to discuss cutting it or eliminating it. We need to expand it. We need to show this country that we care about our people, and it starts at home.
I guess it'd be appropriate to have some questions this time. And I do want to say, I think this discussion has shifted from, is this the most efficient way to build housing, to whether we're cutting it or not. And the only person I've heard say they're cutting it was somebody on the panel over there. So I wish we could look at, are we doing this in an efficient manner versus the program's gone or not? That's not the point of this meeting. We're looking at the finance numbers. Are we doing this in the most efficient way possible? I know Senator Dolezal had a question. I don't know if we can get him on. He's been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you to the panel for the robust discussion. I have a question for the first two gentlemen that spoke to take this. If I were to review a deck as an investor, what would be the IRR that you advertise to your LPs? And then what's a typical IRR that you capture over the life of a project as a GP?
Pre-tax is going to be about 9 to 10, depending on your tax situation. You're going to be somewhere around 6 or 7 after tax rate of return %.
Thank you. And how about on the GP side?
I'm not a GP, so I'll let a GP talk.
Let's see, the GP's annual return, I don't know it fluctuates because of operating expenses that are borne by the partnership. But I'm gonna tell you the typical, let's just say a typical 50 unit, 9% deal. If it has positive cash flow after expenses every year of $20,000 or $30,000, that would be a very typical operating return. So there's not a big windfall every year. One thing I'd like to add a while ago that I forgot, but being a community-based developer, we're bringing much more than just housing to the community. There's an expectation by the DCA to bring services, and that while we can't live lives for people, we can certainly bring some services to them that can change the trajectory of their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a follow-up, if I may, I wasn't necessarily asking for the operating cash flow on these deals. Over the life of a deal, after you've sold the credits, as a GP, what's a typical IRR on a deal?
Well, the GP is the developer that's at risk putting the project together. So I don't know how to really put an internal rate of return on that. There's there's a developer fee that developer gets, but what goes with that is the liability of operating the property by the limited partner and by the regulations of the state for the compliance period, which is 30 years.
Thank you. If you were to look at a typical deal, the one that you referenced earlier in my questioning, what would be the top line revenue to you as the developer on that deal over the life of the deal, inclusive of the sale of the credits?
I didn't understand that.
I didn't understand it either.
So if I can clarify a couple things, if that's all right, to the committee. So one, I think part of the reason why the question is creating a little bit of confusion is the premise. So the credits are received largely by the investor partner, which is in the deal, but the equity that investor provides in return for those credits is going into the bricks and the sticks of the development. And so there's not a credit equity return to the GP, which is why you're kind of getting the response you're getting from Bill. So in a conventional real estate transaction, your investors are going to demand, Chris, what, 15% type returns? At least. And so they're putting that equity in up front, they're demanding those returns. And then the returns to the general partner are going to be those net operating incomes, and then that sale, like I said, 5 to 8 years later. So this program is much different because it only has pretty minimal residual cash flow that Bill talked about. Well, okay, there's not a development incentive in residual cash flow. And then we make them hold this property for 30 years at restricted rents with a covenant on the land. So there's no value to a sale, because if anyone were to buy it, they would receive that restrictive covenant as well and be forced to maintain those low rents. So in a traditional market interaction, the value to the developer is those annual net operating income returns and then the returns on the sale. There's no return going to the developer aside from the developer fee that's generated. And so that fee has to be spread out for the cost of Bill or Kathy's full team's development timeline, but also that 30-year compliance period. So we're doing a one-time upfront fee to cover the full life of the development work, which I think Kathy was wanting to add to.
I also want to mention, as a developer, more often than not, we defer our development fee towards the end to ensure that things are pre-funded, like reserves. We don't actually see that. And then also, at the end of the compliance period, those of us that are in this market are going to work hard to receive preservation credits to continue that property's affordability period. I mean, the hardest thing for us to take is to watch a LIHTC deal at the end of the tax credit compliance period to go private. And all of a sudden, those rents go from $800 to $1,000 a month up to $2,200 all of a sudden, and those families are eliminated from the affordability market. But on the developer's fee that we get, we often defer it. And as far as services, I know, locally, we put a lot of medical facilities into our properties to ensure, especially the 55 and older market, has easy access to medical activities. So there are a lot of ancillary services that these properties provide to the community, not just housing.
I should mention, Philip, you mentioned 15% on a regular real estate deal. Here in Columbus, I'm in a deal, a LIHTC deal. It's regular apartments. I got a 22% return. I like that return. I think that's pretty healthy. If someone showed me a 15% return, I'd probably turn my nose up at it. But on these deals, that's 6 to 10, depending on whether you count taxes or not, percent returns, about as good as you're going to get. Even if the thing turns up early, you've got to do adjusters and such. So that return really can't get much bigger. It might get a point bigger if you got your timing right. But it can go to zero real quick if the project doesn't get completed, if for whatever reason it can't be leased up, or if it runs out of compliance during the 15-year compliance period.
Senator, are you done? Did you have anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel for the response.
Philip, I had maybe some qualifying questions. I don't always know the best way to ask these, so I'm going to direct them at you and see. So we've got the federal government requires, I'm going back to your presentation, requires the state to come up with a third. Now, anecdotally, I get asked questions, we match 100% of what the federal credit is. Is that part that we're required to put in, is that part of a rate reduction that is set by the feds, or is that more a part of, allowing maybe a nicer, more units to be built? I think you may have answered that in all this, but I'm just.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So in a lot of traditional federal grants, like we do homeless intervention at DCA, right? The feds will provide a fixed pot of money, and they'll say the state's got to match it. So it's kind of the structure you're referring to. This is a little bit different, not to be flippant, but the feds are basically saying, we'll give you a third, figure it out. Right. So there's not a requirement. It's more of a recognition that it's less of a required model, and I'm more describing the model that works. So if Bill or Chris is investing in and developing, let's say 150 units in a suburban market, there's going to be a top line cost to that development. Let's say that's $50 million just to make it clean or even. So if the federal credits are going to come in, they're maxed out in what they can fund. The mortgage is maxed out in what it can fund. So if those two combined, let's say 35 million, something around 2/3, I'm doing average numbers. It's not like Bill could then go back and then just build a $35 million development, because 35 is not going to be enough money to build those 150 units. And then you start playing this game where, okay, what if we cut 100 units? Well, then you cut the federal credits and you cut the mortgage, and you keep shrinking the deal smaller and smaller, which is likely, I'm assuming I'm describing the analysis that Chris did, which is, can I make this deal work? Can I put in debt? Well, I got to lower my units, and you end up, the deal just can't work.
No, I get it. I'm just trying to figure out how all that kind of pieces together but the rates are set at the federal level, and the match is part of the overall project. It is really what ends up allowing it to take place, is the way you put it, right?
Correct. So at the federal level, they set the multiplier, which is functionally what 4% and 9% stand for. They look at your costs, and that 4% and 9% are set federally. And so that's where I say we're limited as an agency, because we can't change those percentages.
Right. Well, I know that there's a certain amount of income for which you qualify, if you're below a certain amount of income. And I didn't know where the rent establishment was more a function of the state, federal. Is that, how is that derived? And I go ahead and ask what my follow-up question might be. Is, say, for instance, with inflationary pressures, sometimes you have seniors that are on a very fixed income, for instance. And we've got a very successful senior, housing, affordable housing unit locally. Is there something, within the framework that would weight this if a community needed something maybe that was more senior helpful, or if maybe local community wanted something that was more of a revitalization or rehabilitation effort, versus maybe a new standalone set of apartments. I know that's a lot to ask. Those were my questions that I had written down. Thank you.
I appreciate both of them. So you're referring to the rent limitations, which are set as a federal requirement. And so tax credits are awarded in proportion to the number of units that are affordable. And so that is typically somewhere between 60 and 80% of the area median income. So I mentioned for Columbus earlier, that would be $43,000 to $57,000 a year in income. So I've mentioned real estate fundamentals before. We're going to require every developer to go out and do a market study. They've got to prove that those rents are achievable. They can't just max out the rents to the federal limit and say they're going to charge that. They've got to show that they can actually do it. But they do bump up against, if the market study allows it, they bump up against those federal limits of what rent is affordable. You've probably heard it before. Affordability on the Fed side is they take that annual income. So in the case of Columbus, let's say $57,000. They say 30% of that for rent and utilities is affordable. So they'll take 30%, they'll knock off a certain number for average utility costs in the area, and that's the max rent that you can charge. The other question you asked, which is, well, what if the community has specific needs? So one of the benefits of this program is the federal legislation is pretty thin. If you were required to read any federal reg, I would actually advise that you pick the tax credit regs, maybe 32 pages to read through. And that's by design. It gives the states a lot of flexibility to set the policy. Now, Mitch Kelly on my team, his regulatory document or competitive is about 180 pages. A little bit longer, take a little bit longer to read. But we do have a lot of policies in that encourage a certain amount of preservation in the community. It encourages a certain amount of senior development. It encourages working with programs like our Georgia Initiative for Community Housing, saying what is the community's desire for what they see there, and then how are you showing that you're partnering with that community and building what they need in their community. So we have the ability as a state to lay out a lot of those policies and say, for this market, revitalization is crucial. For this market, they just need supply, and new construction is going to be a high value and priority. So we have that flexibility as the state to set those different policies.
I'll try to just ask one more because I know we're running out of time and other people need to talk. But on the 9% program, so we can go from 70% minimum up to 91, and that's just from us. So are they getting the same 70 to 91% from the federal government? And the reason I ask that is, you talked about Florida and their program of $700 million. It's a loan. They are getting a return on investment, and I'm not talking about homes or anything. I'm just talking about financially. They're getting a return on investment where we're doing a gift of 91%. So that's the reason I asked the question.
So I'll take both of those in order. The first is the 70%. So for those in the room, a 9% credit by federal design is designed to fund about 70% of costs. As an agency, that means we can fund up to 70, and you described 91. We have a discretionary, what's called a boost. We can fund a little bit more in areas of high need. So that's where that higher number you're stating is coming from. That's our ceiling. That doesn't mean we're required to fund that. So because we have a state credit, instead of giving a developer 70% of their costs with federal credits, we'll cut that down to 40 because we don't have to give them 70. And we'll backfill that with state credits. What that means for us on the 9% side, which is what you're talking about, instead of doing 20 deals predominantly in urban and suburban regions that have the rent to drive that additional mortgage that is needed to fill the last gap, instead of those 20 deals with just the federal credit, we can lower the federal credit per deal, backfill it with a state credit, and stretch the federal further. So we're funding more like 30 deals in urban, suburban, and rural markets because of that program. So that 70 to 90%, we're not matching 70 to 90%. We'll toggle that down to maybe 30 to 40% and then match that 30 to 40%, if that makes sense. So it's our responsibility as an agency, and it is written in the regs that we cannot provide more subsidy than is financially necessary for the property to work. So that's our responsibility to make sure that we're having that efficiency of that return. And I apologize, there was a second question. Go ahead, I know you have a response.
So a lot of states do loan programs. You're right, Mr. Chairman. But the issue, you mentioned they get that back. Well, they really don't. It's a soft loan in most states, which is a cash flow loan, meaning if there's profit from the operations of the project, they pay the loan back. And there's usually very, very little profit from the operations of these projects because the rents are capped and operating expenses eat up most of your income, and your hard debt service eats up the remainder. There's some that's paid back. So you have this huge loan balance at the end of the day, and you need to do a rehab to your deal, and you've got, I don't know, $2 or $3 million loan balance 20 years from now, and it's time for a rehab of that deal, and no one's going to refinance anything until you pay that $2 or $3 million back. Now you got yourself a real problem on your hands, where if you had tax credit equity, there's no problem like that at all. So that's why you've seen a lot of states switch from a loan to a state credit, which creates non-taxable equity that creates private investment going in before the state puts any money out at all, unlike a loan.
Well, I was hearing that the Florida program was great, and now I'm hearing it doesn't work. I'm trying to find
It
out.
works. I just don't think it works as well as the state credit.
Okay. The chairman had to step out for a minute. Do y'all have any questions down that way?
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question. It's for Philip. And I've heard the word cap, and I understand what you're saying. It's a limit on the subsidy, the maximum amount a unit can charge, you can charge for a unit is based on household income. And that's what, adjusted gross income on the family side? Obviously, I guess it's the household income, and it's about 30%, it's the max they can pay. How often is that reanalyzed? Is that yearly, adjusted yearly, or is it every 10 years on the census, or?
So those limits are adjusted annually, and then it's our responsibility as an agency to ensure compliance.
So it's really not capped per year as hopefully in an area where Gulfstream's building a lot of airplanes, or Bluebird's bringing a lot of buses, and wages are going up, adjusted gross income's going up. So the amount of revenue coming to the deal does increase with inflation, if nothing else. So if in fact you have some long-term financing, fixed rate, there is more cash flow coming in year over year as just gross incomes go up. Is that not true?
So it's a fair question, and I imagine Bill will want to add to what I'm saying. As an agency, the way we underwrite these deals is that rents are going to grow on average at about 2%, as you stated. The issue is expenses grow at an average of 3%. And so you watch those trend lines over time, and it actually squeezes out the residual income. And Bill could speak to the actuals.
Yeah, we don't need to get in the weeds on all that. You've kind of given me the gist of it. But these are adjusted gross income at a local level, well, correct? So again, given my example, cost of groceries is going to be pretty much the same across the state, but if wages are being driven up because of good schools and good health care and good paying jobs, then the amount of cash flow coming in on these projects can increase, theoretically would be in excess of the average state inflation.
So without getting into the weeds, sir, and I appreciate the question, a couple things are worth noting in that analysis. One is that when the Fed set these rents, they're going to be using trailing data. And so it's not going to keep up with, if the market jumps by 15% this year, Bill's not going to see a 15% increase in what he can charge in rents. So it's both going to be limited because they're using trailing or lagging data, but then the Feds are going to give I'll say, more modest or conservative rent increase than what the market shows. I mean, Bill, you've literally, it's probably illustrative because the last 2 years we've seen rent growths that are somewhat unprecedented. And Bill could probably speak to what he's actually seen in allowable rent increases.
That answers my question. I don't think we need to get in the weeds anymore. That's why my question was, is it reset annually? But if you're saying it's based on trailing data, I understand that. Thank you.
And we're way over time, but Senator Rhett's been patiently waiting for a last question here.
Just a comment. I'm a little late. I had a little car trouble, but I made it. But has anybody talked yet about the spinoff benefits from having low-income housing, where you have not only, y'all did talk about maintenance and cetera. Okay, thank you.
We certainly appreciate the panel. There's probably a lot more to discuss here, but in the interest of time and being fair to those that still need to speak, we need to be done at this time. We thank everyone for being here and your participation and insight for the committee. Look forward to future discussions as well. I think now, Commissioner Nunn, you're next up.
Just facilitating. Is it me? Chairman, should we go ahead and?
Yeah, y'all try to keep the discussion down. If you're leaving, we need to keep this meeting going. We're behind schedule. No more discussion out there, please.
Great. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, all. It is a pleasure to be with you. And for those who don't know me, I'm Christopher Nunn. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, and I'm simply here to help facilitate a discussion that may or may not get into the weeds that our last panel did. But I really want to just quickly kick off by introducing our panelists. And then I'm going to turn it over to them. To my right, from right here in Columbus, from a preservationist perspective, is Justin Krieg with Historic Columbus, and look forward to his perspective. Also, from the preservation perspective, and I think that one of our prior panelists mentioned the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. Ben Sutton has spent his career, like Justin, focused on preservation, and they do fantastic work. And then rounding out the panel at the other end, opposite me, Pace Halter, is the president and COO of W.C. Bradley Real Estate here in Columbus. A couple of years ago, actually, I think it was May of last year, we actually brought our board here to look, ironically, at the great work that they're doing in Columbus related to housing and historic preservation. So look forward to hearing a little bit more about that, and we'll try to help you all catch up a little bit on time. Let me just start, Ben, with teeing it up to you. When this committee first met back in June, I provided a bit of an overview of the historic preservation credits, highlighting the fact that I believe there are 39 states that have, state historic preservation credits. Of course, we also know that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So could you start off just giving us a little perspective about how Georgia's historic preservation credit works and what that drives from an impact standpoint?
All right. Thank you all for having us today. We're really appreciative of the opportunity to talk about the tax credits and the benefits they've had around the state. We have been a national leader in historic preservation since 2002. The state of Georgia has maintained a state income tax credit for income producing properties, but also for residential properties as well. We're one of 37 states that have tax credit of some kind, and one of 26 states to offer credits to individual homeowners. If you could pass that.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So the first thing I want to highlight, of course, is that the Georgia income tax credits for historic rehabilitation are a voluntary program, and they are only available to historic properties that have met some level of significance and are listed in the Georgia Register of Historic Places. And they do require certified rehabilitation. So The work has to meet a particular standard, it has to be reviewed and approved, and the credits are only available once that work has been completed. So it is absolutely an incentive on the back end of a project that allows folks to take on the difficult work of rehabilitating these historic and oftentimes dilapidated properties. So that is the map there for the state credits. In many instances, the income producing projects are community landmarks that have been resurrected and have found a new life as 21st century commercial centers, affordable housing, or revitalized main streets. You'll hear about Columbus's success stories, but it's important to understand that this pattern of success holds true across the state in Bainbridge, Macon, Brunswick, Rome, not only Savannah and Atlanta, which is what a lot of folks think. And then perhaps even more importantly, in less populous areas of the state, the historic tax credit is, as you heard earlier, is often combined with other incentives such as LIHTC to make projects viable. So really great examples of historic schools in communities that have been revitalized to provide affordable housing in Fort Valley, and then the R.J. Taylor Memorial Hospital, which is now veteran housing. There is, as I mentioned, a commercial credit that has an annual cap of $30 million, per project capped at $5 million. There is a residential credit, and that program is capped at $5 million per year, and the per project cap for residential projects is only $100,000. So the residential component has also been a really effective tool in preserving historic housing across the state. And I would like to just emphasize that these credits have been utilized for all types of housing. It's really not just, grand major projects like some might think. It's helped rehabilitate and revitalize workforce housing across the state in a lot of diverse neighborhoods that have suffered years of disinvestment. Unfortunately, the residential credit is actually due to sunset in 2024 if the legislature does not renew the program in the upcoming session. Just, again, some examples of the types of housing that have utilized this credit. And I just want to emphasize that the residential credit in particular, but the historic credit entirely, probably provides the best bang for the buck in terms of the impact on the state. The residential credit, again, annual cap of $5 million. Our typical annual credits claimed per year are about $1 million, so we're not even coming to our cap. And the average credit is $53,000. So for homeowners, that's a really significant investment. For the state, it's a relatively minor cost that has an outsized impact on the historic houses and their neighborhoods. So all of these credits are determined through what's called qualified rehab expenditures, and those QREs reflect hard costs in the projects. They don't necessarily reflect the entire investment in the project, but only what is going into the physical rehabilitation of the project. So hard costs like foundation work, window restoration, or plaster repair. This is true for all of both commercial and residential credits. For the residential credits, I did want to highlight the fact, for most homeowners, an investment on a project like this is going to represent their largest investment that they'll ever make. And the local credits, the residential credits, even more so than the commercial credits, rely on local architects, carpenters, skilled trade. And so these credits not only help the homeowner take on these really sort of challenging and particular projects, but the money that's driven by these projects is local. It stays local. It is utilizing skilled trades. It's utilizing folks in the community. And it quite literally is a representation of the community itself and its historic nature. So the impact of these projects goes beyond any single economic multiplier. It does preserve the character of the neighborhoods, and it builds stronger communities. I did want to highlight in Macon's Bells Hill neighborhood, the residential credit has been utilized really pretty significantly and effectively. And you can see you can at least see the trend line there of the neighborhood and the value of the residential properties. The blue line is the trend line for the Bells Hill neighborhood specifically. The yellow line is the property values for Macon outside of that study area. So again, you cannot get these credits. You have without earning them. You have to make the appropriate investments, and it requires review of all of the work that's done. But it can have a really significant impact, both on obviously on the property itself, but the community around it. And the catalytic effect of these projects, it really cannot be understated. And Justin and Pace will talk more about that in Columbus.
Thank you. So I think that's a really helpful kind of primer. Hopefully that is for you. I made a couple of notes. One, your point about that this is not just a kind of larger metro center market. In fact, I think the data that we've talked about in the past, over the last 10 years, there have been at least 30 to 40 communities all across the state, large and small. I also made note about your point that on the homeowner side, that this may be the largest investment that a homeowner may ever make. And if I understood you correctly, the tax credit is really in helping them to address the challenging costs associated with preservation, as opposed to just rebuild. You also talked about the fact that the credits must be earned. And I know that that's a real technical point. That's where DCA's role comes in both approving the historic approach to the project up front, and then at the end of the project, certifying those costs so that DOR can issue the credits. Thank you for that perspective. I want to shift to Justin briefly. As
Commissioner, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I think this may be a good.
It's your committee.
It's a qualifier. No, I mean, Ben mentioned something. He mentioned homeowner several times over. So, when we talk about some of affordable, housing type stuff, it sounded to me like possibly, that could mean affordable, home ownership. Maybe we're talking about actually adding equity to somebody that owns their home. Is that fair to say, or am I misreading what you're saying there?
Well, no, the homeowner credit is only available to, a residential property that the person is living in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would categorize it as commercial in the commercial credit. And it absolutely
There's a lot of big words when we describe these things. So
yeah,
I just want to make sure. Yeah,
sure.
That just struck me as.
So any of these credits, commercial or residential, you've got to meet a substantial rehabilitation test. So you are investing a significant amount of money, at least 50% of the existing value of the property, and sometimes it's required up to 100%. So it represents a significant investment, and there are rules to follow. There are things that have to be done to earn the credits, and the incentive with the tax credit allows folks to make the choice to do the work properly, or to take on a project that may be more difficult and challenging, but it represents, a significant part of the neighborhood or the community that they live in. So it absolutely can build equity over time and through that initial investment.
Ben, if I might ask a clarifying question just to follow on Chairman Blackman. So for the homeowner credit, the value of the credit is 25% of the total cost, which is really intended, go ahead.
Of the 25% of the qualifying expenditure.
Of the qualifying expenditure, which is intended to defray the additional cost of the preservation, right? So it would therefore encourage preserving homes that are 100 years old in Sparta or Sandersville or parts of the state. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and it's also been utilized in neighborhoods that have seen a significant amount of disinvestment historically.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
That was my basic point there. If we're
So I want to shift over to Justin to talk a little bit about y'all's experience on the local level. I know when we were here, we took advantage of the opportunity to look at some income producing properties. Salt Life's headquarters in the former Coca-Cola bottling facility, but also some of the housing investments, both single-family homeowner and also some of your multifamily. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the impact and what you're seeing here in Columbus?
Thank you all. It's an honor to be on the panel. I appreciate you having me this morning. Justin Krieg, I work for Historic Columbus. We're a privately funded nonprofit. We've been around 50 plus years, and I've been with Historic Columbus for it'll be 15 now. But given the amount of time I had, I just wanted to focus on one particular project and kind of give you all a little window into what a historic rehab tax credit project means to our community. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the demographics in Columbus, second largest city in the state. But when it comes to kind of drilling down into those numbers, we without question have many challenges. And that creates a situation where we need to find ways, and I think we're good at this as a community, it's a learned behavior, but we've been really good at leveraging projects, leveraging different initiatives in our town to get the best bang for our buck. And frankly, the historic rehab tax credit, I think, is an outstanding example of how that works. Now, I will tell you right off the bat, I'm not a numbers guy. I've got a degree in city planning. I can walk through a place and tell you how nice it feels and how pretty it looks. But what I'll tell you is Ben and Pace can fill you in on all the dollars and cents. But City Mills specifically is a property, and Commissioner Nunn, I think you got to take a peek at it along with many of your constituents last year when you came to visit. But this is a property that's part of the National Register Historic Landmark District in Columbus. It's a non-contiguous district along the Chattahoochee River. And it was really the last property that had really yet to be rehabbed or have a plan for. And it ended up being one of Historic Columbus's signature projects a couple years ago. In May of 2015, we purchased this property along with a local investor, frankly, because we didn't have enough cash and we didn't have the deal to be able to put together at the time with the property owner who had owned it for 30, 40 years. But this grist mill really got its start in 1828, the same year that the city of Columbus was formally incorporated. And it operated as a grist mill, producing cornmeal and things like that through the 1980s. And then it went vacant, and it sat alone on essentially an island of disinvested property just north of our uptown area. This is what it looks like from one of the historic American engineering record photos that was taken a number of years ago. This is what the property looked like in May of 2015 when we purchased it. And what's a little deceiving about this photo, besides a few trees growing out of the roof line on the building closest to the river there, is the building closest to you in the foreground with the kind of the white painted entrance. It had a hole in the roof about the size of a small sedan. And so frankly, without investment by Historic Columbus to purchase this property for $800,000 in 2015, in the span of the next 24 months, if a big storm had come through, that building would have likely collapsed. And what I want to kind of paint a picture of is what this project and its rehabilitation has really transitioned into for our community. This is what it looked like 2 years later when we were just beginning to wrap up the stabilization work. At this point, we had repointed all the brickwork, put on a new roof, and we're beginning to button up the windows. This is a really interesting photo, and frankly, there's not a lens big enough in Columbus to capture exactly what I was trying to accomplish here. But this is an image, let's see, around 2020, finishing up some construction on the mill there with the crane in the middle. And what's depicted in this image is kind of leading into uptown. This is an image looking south in Columbus. You've got the Chattahoochee River on the right, which, as many of you I'm sure know, was developed to reestablish the natural flow about 10 years ago. We've got 35 to 45,000 rafters a year that go down the Chattahoochee. We just last month hosted the ICF World Championship. We had a couple hundred countries represented in a major competition that took place in the downtown area. But the investment here in City Mills, it was roughly a total of about $20 million of project cost that it took to turn this facility into a beautiful hotel and frankly anchor for the south end of what Mayor Henderson referred to earlier as really a major gateway into our community. But it helped to kind of solidify and be a somewhat of a catalytic project for a lot of development that came quickly in a year or two later. like I said earlier, City Mills was sitting on an island of vacant and abandoned land. And through some work with the Land Bank Authority here in Columbus, I know what a detriment that can be on a community and how difficult those properties can be to activate. And but for the historic rehab tax credit, it would have never made sense to invest in City Mills. Historic Columbus, like I said, partnered with this individual. We purchased the property for $800,000. Historic Columbus then was thankfully in a financial position. We made a $1.2 million loan to the ownership entity to further stabilize, put the new roof on, button up the windows, and redo the brickwork to stabilize the buildings structurally. And then we frankly shopped the project around. We tried to find investors, developers to take the project further because at that point we were out of cash. And it was only because of some sophisticated owners here in Columbus and some investors that really saw the vision of what was to come that they were willing to put down, like I said, nearly $20 million to rehab this project over the course of a number of years, and now it's finally open. This is what it looks like today. It's a beautiful example of a historic rehab building. It functions as a hotel. It's got a restaurant that's attached to it, as well as a yoga studio in the bottom. But and this, I guess, is somewhat off script for me as a preservationist, but frankly, what has happened beyond the property lines of this project is what has made this project and our community so successful. And that's the leveraging aspect of what we've been able to do with this property. And when I go back to the photo that you see here, you see a building under construction there right in the distance. That's Mercer University's newest addition to Columbus. That's their School of Medicine. I think at full tilt, they'll have 240 medical school students. It very similarly mirrors what they built a number of years ago in Savannah. But without the investment that took place in City Mills and kind of the confidence that was going to take place and the quality of construction that, frankly, a historic rehab demands to qualify for the program, I don't know that Columbus as a community would have jumped on board and been able to help Mercer raise the money to make that project really come to life. But that was a $35+ million investment that Mercer and the local community made, as well as some state funding. But if you kind of flip around and look the other direction, so this is Mercer University here in the foreground, and then City Mills you can see there behind it. And what's a little difficult to make out, I don't know if I've got a laser pointer, I'm right here, there we go. There's a project under construction right here. That's a Columbus Housing Authority development, about $27 to $30 million, roughly 100 units of mixed income that frankly came on the heels of these two investments. And what that has done is it has energized and just ignited a flurry of activity along 2nd Avenue. When you start to add up the millions of dollars of private investment that these two projects and the third with the banks at Mill Village have spurred on, it's nearing $100 million. And that's over a course of 4 to 5 years coming out of a pandemic where there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. But I want just to convey to the panel and the committee that that these credits go beyond just the total project costs and the actual tax credit generated just for the owner. But what this has done, at least for our community, I can't speak for others, Ben is a more statewide organization. So I'm sure there are examples like this throughout the state, and there are, of course, others in Columbus. But this has absolutely been just such a catalytic project for our community and for a community that it's really difficult to attract outside investment. Gerald Mitchell, Brian Salito from the Chamber of Commerce, and Peter Bowden, who's the head of our Convention and Trade Bureau, can attest to, y'all have probably some of the most difficult jobs in town. And but for our community really banding together, jumping in concert together to make lasting patient capital investments, that's really what makes our community unique and authentic. And I think so many communities try to find ways to reinvent themselves. Columbus, I think, at least in my experience in the last 15 years that I've lived here, we have found ways to make our community embrace what's unique and authentic about our place. And a lot of that centers around our historic properties, our historic communities. These credits have been essential to making sure those projects are preserved and those buildings are here to last.
Quick question about the grist mill. It's a beautiful project, and I get the economic development that went around, so kudos for that. But what was your total capital expenditure, or the owner's capital expenditure for that grist mill project?
Right at $20 million.
20 million. And how much tax dollars went into that as far as historic income, our renovation credit, approximately?
We'll have to get you the exact numbers, but I think it's about 4.
4 million.
Yeah.
So it was obviously a good return, given the economic development that birthed out of that whole project. So I guess the gist of it is, when we're going back to the residential historic tax credit program, all you're doing is incentivizing people to spend dollars. The increased cost of construction, matching historic windows and facades and all of the architectural features that make a home historic, is very expensive, and you can't do that absent these historic renovation tax credits are available. I'm very interested in how we can improve that program, both at a residential level and also statewide for the commercial development, specifically where it is a generator of, call it urban renewal or small town renewal. It'd make a heck of a difference in the Americases, which I understand in years past, there was a hotel done down there, in small towns like many of us hail from across Georgia. Y'all got any thoughts about how we could better improve that?
I've got one thought on the residential credit real quick. One of the things that I think we have struggled with, at least here locally, I know Macon has had a very strong residential credit application pool. In Columbus, I don't know if we're just picky individuals, but in the conversation that I've had with our constituents that have looked at doing residential credits, you know, it's your house. It's where you're going to live. And frankly, a lot of the interior restrictions and review have been a bit of a hindrance for people, individuals, homeowners moving forward with a residential credit. And frankly, with a building like City Mills that follows the commercial program, the income producing program, those interior spaces are much more public. But for an individual single family home, the interior is obviously a more private situation. So I don't know if there was a way to look at the standards for rehabilitation to give a little bit more flexibility to people's individual primary residences, but you know, that would be one thing I think would help to bolster that program and the usage of it.
Yeah, I would agree with Justin. I would also point to other states. I'm not trying to sway you, and I didn't come here to make this case, but other states do have a refundability portion to their residential credits. So if you think about a individual homeowner, they're making a significant investment, but they may not have the tax liability that makes sense for a $100,000 credit. But it is carry forward over 10 years. That's an excellent portion of our existing credit. But other states have included a refundability aspect to their residential credits.
Well, thank you both. And Justin, I have to encourage y'all, if you've not seen City Mills, it is a fantastic development. Ironically, you pointed out the banks at Mill Village, the property to the upper part of that, and that is actually a LIHTC mixed income development that was done. In fact, Mayor Henderson and I cut the ribbon on that last April. This is fantastic, the work that this has done, and I love the fact that you pointed out the catalytic effect that it has in communities, whether those are Americus or Columbus or Dalton or Savannah or Dublin. So thank you for that. Pace, I know we're short on time, but it's really important to have a little developer perspective here. W.C. Bradley has been so instrumental to the continued revitalization of Columbus. Appreciate your leadership. Can you talk a little bit about, from a developer standpoint, what this tool means?
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity and the chance to be here today. As Chris alluded to, my name is Pace Alter. I work for the W.C. Bradley Company, which, if you don't know, and I think it is important to put it in the context, we are a 138-year-old privately held company based and founded here in Columbus. So when we talk about historic buildings, we know a little bit about it. Today, we own and manage about 2.5 million square feet of space in every major asset class. The uniqueness of that is 35% of that portfolio are historic buildings. Most of them, if not all of them, in the downtown urban core. And so the comment that was made earlier, and a little bit to Justin's comment, that I think is arguably the most, from my perspective, the most important part of this historic tax credit, it's about economic development, right? That, at the end of the day, is really what allows us as a developer to take a non-economically viable project and turn it to marginal, or take a marginal development and make it work. We are fortunate, and the difference between marginal and working really just deals with the economics of the deal, driven largely by cost of capital, right? And so we strategically have a portion of our portfolio that we deem kind of community investment, and that is done with the board's approval at a less than normal return. And part of that, a big part of that, is driven by the fact that we can apply for and hopefully get these credits. And so, to the point that you made earlier, which I think is really the key element, when you look at the secondary and tertiary towns in the state of Georgia, which is essentially anywhere but Atlanta, you know, it is the driver for what allows these secondary and tertiary towns to revitalize themselves, arguably more than anything else. Now, yes, you have to have a private element to that that is willing to make the investment alongside the state and, in most cases, the federal government. But were it not for those credits, those projects, and it was alluded to earlier in the housing tax credit, they don't get done. And so you end up with blighted buildings that sit empty and ultimately dilapidate to the point of demolition. So that really is the way that we look at it. It really is an economic driver for what we do, particularly on our historic buildings.
And Pace, I know that y'all do both commercial and residential. Could you share kind of the breakdown on the commercial and the residential side?
Yeah, so if you look at our portfolio as a whole, we are almost exactly a third, a third, a third. So a third of our portfolio is residential, a third is office, and a third is other. So other would include retail. We own a film and television studio, so it would include other items, industrial, like that. So we're almost evenly split across the portfolio. We have historic buildings in every part of that portfolio except the industrial piece.
Questions?
Yeah, just can you talk through, and it can be the developer or you, Commissioner, about the process and the length of time? Because I've always heard that, yeah, the credits are fantastic, but the length of time to go through the process and the speed, especially with interest rates at 8%, if you will, the speed for these things to kind of kick in is always been a little bit frustrating. So as someone who's developed some downtown stuff, we've always just done it to get it done, get to market quick with what we're trying to do. So any information on that would be great.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version from our perspective. So as was alluded to earlier, obviously the credits are back-end loaded, right? So we're putting out all of the capital up front, whether that's internal capital or borrowed capital, and those credits come on the back end. So you do have a little bit of the luxury of time. Now, that assumes that you have the ability and the willingness to start the project, not knowing if you have the credits approved, which is typically what we will do on, you know, a hope that we are ultimately going to get the credits. Fortunately, knock on wood, we always have. Now, if you are in a situation where you need those credits and you have to know that you have that approval prior to starting it, then I think it does create a time issue. And to your point, if you own the asset or you're making that investment, and now with interest meters running at the rate that they're running, it can be a challenge for sure. You know, is there an opportunity to expedite that process? Yeah, I think maybe there is. But there's a lot that goes into it, as you've heard earlier, from the approval of the plans, making sure that the buildings are going to meet the historic requirements that you have to apply to the redevelopment of those assets. And so it's a lengthy process just from a design standpoint, let alone actually getting those credits approved.
I would just add that commercial projects are also eligible for a federal rehabilitation credit. And so that frequently, that is an additional review process and timeline. I think a lot of the frustration that I've heard from the state or from around the state is when these projects are sent to DC for review, that adds an extra 60, 90 days to each phase of the process. But at the state level, you know, if a project is only utilizing state credits, I think the process can be quicker.
Yeah, I know we need to probably move on, Commissioner, I mean, I can get with you afterwards, but I think what I was, viewing this as, you can take an entire section, and, rehabilitate based on the name of it. And you're not just helping the people that are rehabilitating, but everybody around it. And that raises that entire section or a particular part of an area, up out of that blight that you mentioned, Pace. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. I know. Yeah, I know we're moving along. We want to save enough time. It's Dr. Greg George is with us from Middle Georgia State University. I'm going to read a little bit about him. I'm very excited that we're able to hear from him back in kind of the Middle Georgia area, and he's a friend, and I know he has some good perspectives that he's going to share with us, this morning. But he is the director for the Center of Economic Analysis at Middle Georgia State University. He received his PhD in economics and master's degree at the University of South Carolina and undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina. That won't win you any points here, Dr. George. No, I'm kidding. Since 2009, Dr. George has worked with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta through their Regional Economic Information Network, providing regional economic intelligence and serving as the chair of their Economic Advisory Council for Middle Georgia. Dr. George has twice testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Tax Reform and consults with a wide variety of government agencies regarding tax policy and budget issues. He's also assisted the U.S. Attorney General's office to detect bank fraud under the Federal False Claims Act and currently assists the South Carolina Department of Revenue in multi-state corporate tax evasion cases. I know in your spare time you've got a few hobbies, including fly fishing and skiing and doing a little mountain climbing at times. So welcome, Dr. George. Thank you for making the trip over, and please, the podium and floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. She's pulling up mine. Well, thank you, first of all, for the introduction. It sounded great because I wrote it. So that's, if you were impressed by it, you should have been. I tried to make it sound good. Where am I at here? There we go. First of all, I want to thank Representative Blackman for inviting me to speak here to you guys. It's a professional obligation to do outreach and to speak and to project our expertise into the community. So I take that role in my job seriously. It's also, I consider, a civic responsibility to help in the legislative process in any way that I can. So I want to go through and just give you a quick little outline here of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet. First, I'm going to go a little bit more through my background so you can calibrate the information that you're getting from me and know exactly where it's coming from. So I'll expand a little bit on my background and some of the things I've been doing related to tax policy. I'll also give you some of my takeaways from Senate Bill 6. I took the chance to read it last night, and boy, was it a page turner. Sorry for anybody who sponsored the bill, but I did want to talk about some of the economics that were embedded in there, and then we're going to do some relevant economics of taxation. As a professor, I have to do a little bit of economics here. That portion will also be referred to as nap time for some of you. And then, not that I was asked to give my recommendations, but I will. They're free and worth every penny. So, a couple of things that were mentioned in my bio. I have been working with the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, and I have to do a disclaimer whenever I speak publicly. Because of my affiliation with the Atlanta Fed, everything that I say is my own opinion and does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. I'm also the director of the Center for Economic Analysis. I founded that back in 2005, and I've been the director since about then. And the Center for Economic Analysis has done a lot. I've done a lot of these economic impact studies, which are important in this committee's process. So I do want to be able to speak to that. I've got some background in doing those.
And I'm specifically going to talk to you today about some of the limitations of them and the way to read those, because sometimes people think they're trying to say more than they do. So I want to give some background on that. Relevant to what we're doing here today, I've been representing Department of Revenue in South Carolina. I just testified in administrative law court over the summer on behalf of the Department of Revenue, looking at multi-state issues. There's a lot of multi-state corporations, and the overlying act that kind of governs this was never passed, but it's an idea, UDIPTA, which is Unified Division of Income Taxes, Unified Division of Income for Tax Purposes Act. And it has to do with how corporations allocate their revenue or their income to various states for the purposes of paying taxes in those states. And what I've learned from that is that accountants and lawyers are really good at moving their tax burden from state to state, and tax policy plays into that. The more that you tinker with tax policy, the more dimensions accountants and lawyers have to shift those elsewhere. And just so you know, a lot of people are telling Georgia that they're paying their taxes in South Carolina, and then they're telling South Carolina they're paying them in Georgia, and you guys never talk to each other, so you never find out that. So it's just something to consider. I've also I've been hired by a lobbying group, a political action committee, to get the OLOST on the ballot in Macon. It stemmed out of Columbus passing an operational local option sales tax unconstitutionally, so we made it constitutional by getting that passed, and it's a good thing. We're glad Columbus did it. I got a lot of good data from Columbus that helped us make our argument for getting the OLOST passed in Macon-Bibb County. Also, I have testified before various Senate subcommittees on tax reform. Those were more related to sales taxes, but I've been in this situation before. And I also worked on a tax incentive program, Opportunity Zones, as the Middle Georgia Opportunity Zone liaison. Haven't done a lot with that recently, but that's another tax thing that I've been working on. So as far as Senate Bill 6, for those of you who haven't read it, just to kind of give a little background in the spirit of this bill from an economist's perspective. First of all, after reading it, I realized it was actually, from an economist perspective, it is a good bill. It gives power to the legislature to review and modify and create new tax incentive programs as they see fit. In particular, the review process means that you have to hire economists, so there's some job security in there for my people, and it requires that these impact studies are produced independently, which is a good thing, every year. And I think you're doing about 5 a year. As far as one thing that jumped out at me in the bill, there's a focus on looking at these economic impact studies as if they're going to tell us exactly how beneficial these programs are. And just let me talk to that for a second. Like I said, I've done a bunch of these. The ones in this that were submitted for the purposes of this committee, half of them were done by economists. The other half was done by a public policy institute. So the public policy ones are a little bit different than what I do. They're more policy oriented. The economic ones done by Georgia Southern are right up the alley of what I typically do. And what they do is they take any investment, any expenditure, for instance, on a tax credit or something, and they look at the economic activity that creates, and they simply produce a couple of variables. One is the number of jobs that it creates. That's both direct and indirect jobs. Another variable that we can kind of tease out of that is the overall economic activity that is generated, and that's when that dollar is spent at a restaurant, the waiter then has a little bit of money to go spend at the convenience store, and that works its way through the economy and creates a big number of economic activity, usually a lot of zeros that kind of people look at and just say, ooh, it's a big number. And then you can also get the contribution to GDP, local GDP, which is called value add, out of there. And then you can look at the impact on earnings. Individual earnings is another thing you can get out of those data. All of that is based on actual real-world data on how money flows through an economy. So those numbers are as accurate as the inputs. But what they exclude is a lot of other things. In a nutshell, economists look at this thing called standard of living. And standard of living is your access to goods and services. It's all market-based stuff. We can place a value on those things. And the more stuff you have access to, the higher your standard of living. But what you guys feel is not standard of living. You feel quality of life. Quality of life includes a lot of non-monetary things like faith, like friendship, like health, those kind of things that if you think about it, those are the real important things that sustain you through life. And the other part is just kind of a proxy for that. So you have to be careful about how much weight you put in this. We're measuring standard of living. We're not measuring quality of life. And a lot of these tax policies not only impact standard of living, but more importantly, they will impact our quality of life. And we can't capture that. So there's just a limitation in what you can do with these things. So you'll see this focus on jobs and that jobs, it creates this many jobs. I want to do a word of caution on hyper-focusing on jobs. I know that politically that's a strong arguing point. Creating jobs is always something that you hear during the election season. It's an important part. It's an important part of our economy. The economics of jobs are a little bit different than the conventional wisdom of jobs. Jobs occupy labor resources. Jobs tie up a labor resource. What's important is labor, not jobs. There are good jobs and bad jobs. Moving workers into bad jobs is not a good thing. So you got to be really careful about just kind of jobs arguments, because you got to put labor units to their highest valued use in the economy. Otherwise, you're wasting them, and that's a crime. You can't do that. So something to think about. Look beyond just the number of jobs, which is all these things produce, is the number. They don't tell you the quality of those jobs. Something important to think about. And economic development, that word is thrown around a lot. Economies tend to develop on their own, and we can kind of lean against the wind and lean with the wind in terms of our policy choices. But the economy is either going to grow or not, sometimes irrespective of what we do. That doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of coming up with good policies. It just means that economic development is more of a passive activity that we try to make active through micromanagement, and we try to make it active through our best intentions. And sometimes the economy just doesn't care, and it'll do what it's going to do. So again, you need good policies, but understand that economies will develop or fail many times on their own, despite our best intentions. And that just brings us to these other public interest considerations. Again, economic impact studies don't capture that. They don't capture the quality of life elements. So you have to take that with a grain of salt and understand that those are the things that, as this joint committee is becoming well aware of, those are the things that you really have to focus on. What is the value of having rehabilitated cultural iconic buildings in town? That it may not have been the best economic value. Maybe a strip mall would have created a higher return on investment, but it might have also been an eyesore that didn't make anybody in town particularly proud. So those are the qualitative as opposed to quantitative things that you have to consider. Also, a note on the efficacy of economic incentives. Tax credits are economic incentives, and they do work. You put a carrot in front of a horse, the horse will pull the cart. That's going to happen. And sometimes they work too well. You got to be careful. Again, in economics, we don't think about just doing more of something. We think about optimality, doing the right amount of something. You got to put enough carrots in front of the horse to make it pull as much as you want to. But if you put too many carrots in front of the horse, he's going to break the cart apart, pulling the thing too dang fast. So you have to be intentional with how you structure these things. Unfortunately, we're kind of thinking about, should we or shouldn't we do this? Well, the question should be, are we doing the right level of these things? Are we doing too much or too little of these things? And that's where these studies can lend some context. So the economics lecture, real quickly, let me go through and just for the benefit of the council, or for the committee rather, talk about some of the some of the important economic considerations when looking at tax policy. Historically, economists have broken down quality tax policies over two metrics, and they're equity and efficiency. Efficiency is basically the cost of administering the tax policy. It's also a little bit deeper than that. It's a way of thinking about how tax policy distorts the economy. Free markets tend to run themselves pretty well. That doesn't mean they're free of distortion. It doesn't mean they don't have problems. They're not perfect. But free markets tend to produce the most efficient outcomes, with very few exceptions. Anytime you change the market structure with tax policy, you will change behavior and you will create distortions that will make it slightly less efficient. The key is to make it not too inefficient. It's worth it to impose taxes to get the public services that we need. You just want to do it in the most cost-effective way possible. That's the efficiency argument, basically. And that takes a lot of consideration because economies are very complex. We'll talk about that in a second as well. So efficiency, think in terms of how much does it cost to do the policy and what are the distortions that it causes. I'll give you a quick example. The lottery is a tax. The Georgia State Lottery is a tax, and that's probably a grenade I just threw into the room here, but I'll go there anyways. And as a tax, it's actually very efficient in one respect. That is, it's very cheap to collect. The government doesn't have to go hold a gun to your head and make you buy a lottery ticket. You do it voluntarily. You burn your own gas doing it. The government doesn't have to spend a penny to get your money that way. So it's a revenue generator. I think it generates in this state as much as the corporate income tax generates that we're talking about today. So it's a very efficient tax. You don't have to do anything to get it. There's another component, though, to taxes that determine the quality of the tax, and that is the equity or the fairness of the tax. And the problem from an economics perspective with the lottery is not the efficiency. It's very efficient in its collection. The problem is that it's inequitable. Generally speaking, low-income people play the lottery. The average lottery expenditures per person, per capita, it's every man, woman, and child in the state, is $700 a year. I don't know how much you guys are spending on lottery tickets, but if you're not spending $700, someone else who's probably much lower income than you is paying that $700 for you. So it's a huge expense, and it causes inefficient distortions on that back end with the issues it causes down there. So just something to consider, the efficiency and equity of taxes. Income taxation in general, personal income taxation, is considered equitable because you can make it progressive. You can tax rich people more than poor people, and that's not regressive, which is what you see in the lottery, where it's actually taxing poor people at a higher rate than rich people, since rich people don't play the lottery that much. So what does that mean about tax credits? Tax credits are a little bit different because we're not talking about imposing a tax, we're talking about relieving a tax. So you really need to look at the efficiency as being how much bang are we getting for the buck. And when it comes to fairness, you need to think about exactly how fair are they. As it turns out, by an economic metric, tax credits are not particularly efficient or equitable. Moral philosophers have come up with different definitions for fairness or equity, but there's distributive, retributive, and procedural equity or fairness. And distributive is, are these things distributed evenly among people? Are we splitting up the pie evenly? And obviously not. We're giving some tax credits to some people and not to other groups. So there's an unequal division of the pie, one measure of fairness. Retributive is the fairness in punishment. Does the punishment equal the crime? And some people who do not receive the credits are punished unfairly because they're not receiving the credits, where other people do receive the credits. So it kind of fails on those two fronts. And procedural is how are these things administered? Are they allocated arbitrarily or ad hoc? And to some degree they are, based on the political process. Some things pop up and some don't. So it really, there are some equity considerations, and that brings us to the next principle in economics that I think is important for you guys to think about. And by the way, I forgot to mention this. I'm not here to tell you guys how to make your decisions or how to do your job. I'm not a legislator. I don't do politics well. What I'm trying to do is just kind of give you some context and give you some economics to incorporate into your thinking on this matter. And an important concept, and I talked to this with Representative Blackman a while back, a few months ago, I guess. And it's this not well-known theory in economics, but an important theorem called the theory of the second best. And without getting into a long lecture on this, it's something that all good decision makers should consider, especially in the legislative process. In a nutshell, the members of the committee are dealing with a very complex problem. You've got a single state, Georgia, operating in a southeastern region with multiple states around it, all with differing tax policies that you're competing with for business. You want to develop a tax policy that is both efficient and equitable. You want to develop a tax policy that gets the maximum bang for the buck for the residents of the community and for your constituents. You've got competing forces, you've got political parties going back and forth, arguing over these things. It's an extremely complex ecosystem that you're operating in here. Whenever you make changes in that system, you create distortions. And what you have now is a very complex system with a lot of pre-existing distortions. You have tax incentives here, you've got tax breaks here, you've got taxes on these things, not on those things. You've got sales taxes that exclude grocery items but include things. All of that distorts behavior in the economy. Now here's the issue with that. That being said, the complex tax problem that you're confronted with, you might have nailed it. You might have had it. It might be perfect right now. You might have hit every single lever at the exact right level so that you've reached the most efficient and equitable outcome possible. Not likely, but possible. More importantly, there's one better solution if you are at that kind of best complex distorted system, and that is the theoretical optimum. What is the perfect system? Well, ideally, if markets are truly efficient, you would have no tax credits and just a very low tax rate. That would give benefits to everybody. It would distort the economy as least as possible. And that could be what we would consider in economics the first best solution. Now that's a theoretical optimum because there are distortions such as externalities and all kinds of problems that can arise that we want to tinker with later. But just starting from a theoretical baseline, the first best solution would be a very low tax policy, no tax credits, let the market determine the flow of goods and services and the flow of development and all that stuff. In that world, be careful because you might not have historic buildings. You might not have low-income housing. You might not get some things that we value, but you're going to reach the economic efficient outcome. Let's just call that the first best solution, though, because it's efficient and in one degree it's equitable. If right now, with the complex system that you're operating in, with all the pre-existing distortions, if you're at the second best solution right now, any changes that you make that aren't the first best will necessarily make things worse, not better. So that gives you a lot of responsibility to think about the complexities of these situations. Even getting rid of one tax incentive might be, say, a step in the right direction, but it will cause cascading effects throughout the system, which might actually lower our social welfare overall. So it's just it's a word of warning to consider the complexities of the situation, and you just can't boilerplate these things down to one economic impact study. It's not going to give you the level of information, the nuance that you need to understand the problem you're dealing with here. Last little point of economics here I'll make before I get into my last few comments is tax competitiveness. The work I'm doing in South Carolina has shown me the light. A lot of my testimony revolves around corporations moving profits from state to state. And one thing that you see them doing quite often is saying that they're moving their income tax from here to, say, Minnesota, or from South Carolina to Minnesota. South Carolina has a 5% corporate income tax rate. And their accountants were saying, no, that we're attributing those profits not to South Carolina, but to Minnesota. And my question was, why? And they're like, well, it's just the way it makes sense theoretically with the tax code and this, that, and the other. I said, so you're voluntarily taking profits from a 5% state and moving them to a 9% tax state. You need new accountants. That's not a good thing to do. And again, there's a lot of tax competition, and you have to look at the relative rates, and that will attract business. So if you look at the southeastern states, 6 or 7 southeastern states of concern from North Carolina to Florida over to Mississippi, the lowest tax rate is North Carolina at 2.5%. That's their corporate income tax rate. They're trying to phase that out to 0. By the way, not a bad idea. Corporate income taxes in Georgia only generate 4% of your total revenue. It's just not that big of an income generator for you. So you can spend a lot of time playing with these things, but you're making as much from the lottery. And so it's something to consider. Also, for every 1% that you raise the corporate income tax, you can raise the sales tax in the state by 1/6% and get the same results. Flip that around. For every 1% you raise the sales tax, you would have to raise the corporate income tax 7 percentage points to get the same results. Something to consider. We're at 5 3/4. We've come down since my last testimony. I did actually, when I testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Tax Reform, I did mention lowering the corporate tax rate. I don't think it was because of me, but we actually have in Georgia done that from 6.5 or so down to 5 3/4. You have to understand that firms are looking at that. You do want to be competitive with your neighboring states. Alabama's at 6.5%. Let them stay there. Shh, don't tell them, because that's going to push people into Georgia. Something you guys need to be aware of, and keep an eye on those because they are changing. I'm not sure how the elections worked out yesterday in North Carolina. They may have put a freeze on that, but their intention was to go to 0 on their corporate tax rates. So some macro trends. We've heard a little bit about this today, and I want to speak to some of these things. We're talking about job creation. We're talking about growth in the economy, and I came up with a few jobs here. Prompt engineer, shoutcaster. Have you heard of these jobs, by the way? That looks like ethicist. I can't. It's AI ethicist. I put it together to make it look funny. And then influence manager. These are jobs that did not exist, some of them a year ago. Most of them did not exist 5 years ago. You're making tax policy now that will influence economic activity in the state for the next 5 or 10 years for jobs that don't even exist yet, that will exist next year and the year after that. So as an educator, I tell my students this, I'm educating you, I'm training you for jobs that don't exist yet. But by the time you graduate, there'll be new jobs. If you're curious, a prompt engineer, that's AI, telling the AI how to do stuff for you and doing it correctly. There's advertisements, as of last month, there were advertisements for 6-figure jobs in prompt engineering, just talking to AI. Shoutcaster is in the video game world. They live stream video games to huge audiences. More people watched the League of Legends Championship last year than watched the Kentucky Derby. So you've got people people playing video games, and instead of broadcasters, they have shoutcasters because they get really excited and they yell and they scream and they throw stuff, and they're called shoutcasters, and they're pretty good. AI ethicist, I guess we can all worry about that. And influence manager, you got to, if you are an influencer online, I've got a friend here in Columbus, matter of fact, Sean, he goes by Tagback TV on YouTube. He's doing about $500,000 a year playing children's video games, some kind of farm game, I don't know what it is, and he's an influencer. Kids run to their parents, buy me this, buy me that. So he's got a staff playing a video game on TV. That job didn't exist 5 years ago, but he's in Georgia, he's in Columbus, and he's paying taxes here, and he's a lot of them for that matter, and no one even knows that's kind of going on. One thing also, I'm running out of time here, but I'm almost done. Demographics are important. The state is growing, but it's growing in the wrong way. We've got a demographic time bomb ticking right now. Namely, I've been doing a lot of consulting work with local private schools who were losing enrollment. And they were wondering, what are we doing wrong? Why don't we have families enrolling in our private school anymore? And I looked at the public schools and I noticed that enrollment was going down there too. And then I started looking at demographics, and we aren't making babies. We're not doing that as much. Our fertility rate has dropped. From 2008, we were at replacement rate nationwide, which is about 2.1 children per mother. You have to be at 2.1 just to keep the population stable. We're at 1.67 in Georgia now. And if you look at the breakdown of demographics, the 0 to 4-year-old age group has been cut from 7.1% of the population to 5.9% of the population. We're losing young kids. We're just not making, actually, we're not making them in the first place. What I told the private school, it's like, you're doing nothing wrong. You cannot sell credit hours to children that were never born. And the problem is, this started 10, 15 years ago. It's showing up in the high schools, the K through 12 high schools now, and it's starting to show up in the colleges and universities. We're being told as professors we're not doing a good enough job because we're not attracting enough students. It's like, well, they didn't make them. They're not there. So this is an ongoing problem. It's a huge problem. You have to have that 18 to 34-year-old demographic working in the state, producing children, going to our schools, and consuming goods and services. They're the biggest consumer group in the economy, and consumption is 70% of the economy. You have to have that going. Whatever you guys do with tax incentives, you got to figure out how to get that age group into this state. We are growing, but the growth is in the 65 and older age group, and they tend to be a drain on social services, and they don't contribute as much in terms of tax base and stuff like that. And they're on fixed income, and there's all kinds of issues there, but they do vote. They vote a lot. Because of the aging population that we have, oh, by the way, the 10 years ago, I was talking to groups about Japan, and they had just started selling more adult diapers than baby diapers in Japan. That happened in China a few years ago, and it happened in North America last year. More adult diapers than baby diapers. We have baby boomers aging. We have an aging population. We've got to bring in that young workforce. That's where it's going to be a problem for our schools, because we get huge federal subsidies in education. We're not going to get those if we don't have kids. So we have to be very intentional with a lot of these things. I did look at some of the growth industries: health, social services, professional sciences, technical services. That's 66% of new jobs by both volume and pay. Other areas that are important in the state: financial, fintech, logistics, and chip manufacturers is one that has been a huge buzzword recently. And I was curious why we weren't getting some of these. There's about 5 or 6 chip manufacturing facilities going up right now. They'll all be online by 2030. One in Ohio is going to be ready in 2 years. It takes a while to get these going. What you need to manufacture computer chips, modern computer chips, which we don't do in this country, mostly done in Taiwan, is the sub 10 nanometer transistor chips, the very, very, very small circuit chips. We make the bigger ones, so does China, but we need to make the smaller ones, and we've actually coming online with a lot of those. What you need is a lot of water and technical expertise to make these chips. The wafering process requires a lot of ultra pure water. Some states have made the investment in those areas, and they've attracted these huge chip manufacturing facilities. It's a nice high-tech job, a lot of spillover stuff, something that I was hoping that I'd see Georgia in, but we might have missed the boat on that one, but that's out there. Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. So real quickly, finish up here with my 2 cents worth. Be intentional and forward-looking. This is a long game we're playing. I know you guys have a December 1st deadline to get your report in and to make all the necessary changes. But really, we're looking at a 5 to 10 year issue here when it comes to demographics, when it comes to economic development, growth in the economy, and things like that. And it's a pretty critical turning point, and you just have to attract people. We got to get people into the state because we're not making them on our own fast enough. Consider the social welfare implications, this idea of quality of life or standard of living. It's important. Look at the economic impact studies. I'll just tell you this: the best way to think about those economic impact studies, if you've already decided everything else is equal between policy A and policy B, and then one economic impact study says it'll generate 20 jobs and the other one says 10 jobs, do the one with 20 jobs. But all that other stuff has to be equal first, and all that other stuff ties in with quality of life and the needs of your constituents. What are those needs? What is it that they want for their communities? Eliminate failures. I was looking through the U.S. Trade Commission's U.S. tariff schedule, taxes that we placed on imports. Most of these taxes on imports are there to preserve jobs. And I came across one that was a 70% tax, 70, on rubber boots, imported rubber boots. And that's part of the 1,711 pages of tariffs that we implement on countries around the world. So whenever rubber boots are imported in this country, ultimately the consumer pays a 70% sales tax. You never see that. It's not on the receipt. It's embedded in the price. So a $10 pair of boots starts at 17. The way that tariff got in there was sometimes back in 1950. I imagine there was this organization called the American Association of Rubber Boot Manufacturers, and they lobbied the federal government to get a 70% tariff to protect, a protective tariff to protect their jobs, to make imports more expensive so they could compete better. By 1980s, it didn't work. All of those rubber boot manufacturers went out of business. Most of our shoe manufacturer has shifted over to China. The joke is we can't fight a war with China because we have to fight them barefooted because they make all of our shoes. So for the better part of 40 years, we have not produced any rubber boots in this country, but the policy enacted in the 1950s to protect rubber boot manufacturing jobs is still being paid by consumers today. Why is that still there? We've got a 70% sales tax to save jobs that no longer exist in this country. Get rid of the failures. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. And you'll find some of those if you do a deep dive into the tax credits. Some that just aren't being used, for instance. Focus on labor-intensive industries. Again, we need to get people, we need warm bodies, we need young bodies in here to fill the consumer void and the student void that we're facing. It's going to be a problem for the next 10 or 15 years if we don't fix it. And then keep an eye on your competition. Just follow along with North Carolina, follow along, see if Alabama if they stay at 6.5%, great. And again, think long term. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to share. If we can, you want to go right to the panel to take questions, and I'll just.
Yeah, Dr. George, that was great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Give him a round of applause, please. I think we have our chamber executive, CEO, here is going to manage this next panel, and Dr. George is going to be joining that. So if the panelists have any questions, they can be directed at whomever.
Absolutely.
Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Gerald Mitchell. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Columbus, Georgia Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank everybody for sticking with us. I'm going to be brief this morning, but I certainly want to very quickly thank this review panel for coming to Columbus. Thanks so much to Chairman Blackman and Chairman Huffstetler, as well as Representatives Buckner from the Columbus area, Representative Carpenter, Williamson, Hatchett, and then Senators Albers, Dolezal, and Rhett, and everybody else that helps. We really appreciate your leadership, and we value your effort to take a look at this toolbox that's so important to what we do. I also like to give a special thank you to the Columbus delegation that, again, is there for us every step of the way in the things that we do and continue to help us in our efforts to make Columbus vibrant from an economic standpoint or economic development standpoint. As a region, we continue to see good economic development activity. Company expansions are happening. Growing jobs pipelines continue to thrive. We're also, as you heard on other panels, are seeing lots of redevelopment activity that, again, are driving good economics and job growth. So as this panel advances, what we hope that you're going to hear in their commentary are thoughts about research and development tax credits, about the quality jobs tax credit, about high-tech computing equipment, accounting and other financial supports, as well as including activities that are specific to the various industries that are represented here. And lastly, the direct impact on jobs and future investments that these companies make. So in that vein, you're going to hear from again, Dr. George, who we've gotten a lot of, I think, really good background information from, as well as Matt Reed, Senior Vice President or Senior Director of Tax and Reporting at Synovus. And then Darren Hicks, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Relations at Global Payments. So again, we'll start with comments from Matt Reed.
So first, thanks for having me here today. I know we're over time, so I'll try to keep it brief. We did have a really good discussion about the low-income housing program earlier, and I wanted to echo a few comments made there. So first, Synovus as a financial institution, the low-income housing credit program in Georgia is by far and away the most important tax credit program to us. We've invested inception to today in over 2,000 affordable housing units in Georgia, and that's going to increase up to over 3,000 by the end of next year, totaling about $300+ million. And from the chair that I sit in, the tax role, obviously the stream of tax credits that the low-income housing program generates for us is great from a tax cash flow perspective, great for the bank's capital, and et cetera. But if you ask other leaders in the bank, you need to look at the low-income housing credit program much more holistically. I mean, this generates significant additional business relationships for Synovus as a bank, and we prefer, obviously, to be the financier on a lot of these projects, and we've written hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of construction and bridge finance loans and generated tens of millions of deposits for the bank as a result of participating in the tax credit program. So there's really some secondary effects for the bank that are extremely positive that we would not have but for participating in the tax credit program. There's also just great stories behind each of the investments that we make in the low-income housing space. There was one, and just again to echo comments made earlier, in a rural community in Georgia, we invested in what turned out to be the first apartment project in that community, which is kind of shocking, but it's also really interesting because nobody wanted to go in there and build this absent a tax credit program to support that. There's another that we're working on in Atlanta right now that is the revitalization of a disused commercial space that is 100+ years old, and it's really going to help revitalize the community. And we could go down the list to the dozens and dozens of specific projects we've invested in, and they're all really good stories like that. The other tax credit program I wanted to touch on, more important for us, is the retraining tax credit. It's really not a secret that the environment that banks are operating in is just shifting really rapidly. Over 20% of bank customers don't even go into a branch anymore. It's all online. It's all in an app. So we've had to make significant investments, as a company in our, technology stack, in our app, website, our software base, and that is extremely expensive. We've also had to invest millions and millions of dollars a year in, training our employees on these new tools, to bring them into the current technological age, whether it's, something as straightforward as upgrading our ATMs to implementing Salesforce to other tools that are used, across the industry that are making these, much more versatile employees. And that credit in particular has been, very lucrative for us for the past several years, really since, the pandemic, I think, accelerated, technological adoption and advancement in our industry at an even greater pace. We've invested significant dollars in our employees, and every dollar that this tax credit returns to us is turned around and invested right back in the employees again. So it's kind of a continuous cycle as we, modernize the bank and compete with fintechs and look to be a more tech-driven company. I mean, Synovus was acknowledged, I think, in 2021 as one of the top 10 technology companies, innovative technology companies in the state of Georgia, which you wouldn't expect a bank, to fit that bill, but that's just kind of a testament to what we're doing, as a result of some of the dollars that are being granted to us under these credits.
And now we'll hear comments from, unless there are questions, we'll hear from Darren Hicks at Global Payments.
Again, my name's Darren Hicks, and I serve as Head of Government Relations for Global Payments. And thank you for allowing us to participate here today, and I will be brief. Global Payments is a Fortune 500 company headquartered here in Georgia, and we provide payment processing services for merchants and for financial institutions around the globe. And I frequently tell folks that we're a company that you probably deal with on a daily basis and have no idea you're dealing with us. And you'll also be glad to hear I'm not an expert on tax or an economist. But I did want to take this opportunity to briefly explain to you why the R&D tax credit is important to our company. Because I feel like if we don't say it to you, there's no reason we should assume you know it. So I appreciate the opportunity to come before the panel and say that. The payments industry that we are in is constantly changing and evolving with new competitors entering the market every single day. More so today than at any time in history. And our ability to compete is dependent on investment in innovation and constant development. Investment means R&D, and it's the heart of what we do. If you go 4 miles southwest from where we are sitting right now, you'll run into the TSYS campus. And that's the Global Payments Company located here in Columbus. And for those of you who have been around Columbus for a while, you know TSYS is a household name. Everybody knows somebody who works at TSYS, has worked at TSYS, or has retired from TSYS. And in fact, there are a lot of places around this country and around the globe where Global Payments and TSYS could perform research and development. We do it here mostly in Georgia. And in fact, most of the research development that we do here in Georgia is done at that campus that sits downtown in the TSYS campus. And when we say research and development, I think we get lost in the term sometimes. What we're talking about is the people who perform the work. That's where the investment is. It's in the people who perform the work, who work here at TSYS, who work here in Columbus, Georgia. And so as an employee of the company, someone who works here in this city, that's very important to me. That's the impact. That's the reason why we invest in R&D, is because we have to. And the manifestation of that is the people who work here in this community. But the impact of the tax credit for R&D extends beyond just our company. If you remember back from the prior panel, you had that photo of City Mills, and then you had Mercer Medical School right above it. But if you'd have seen the big facility that was just the next building or series of buildings, that was the TSYS campus that we have that sits downtown on the Chattahoochee River. And I say that because I spend, it feels like, most of my life in downtown Columbus. And if you get up in the morning, you go to have coffee at Iron Bank Coffee or Fountain City Coffee, you will find TSYS employees getting coffee and a muffin there. When I go to Country's Barbecue for lunch, which sits right across the street from our campus, that I think I keep afloat personally, you will run into TSYS employees there. In the evenings, if you go to Ma Bella's downtown, you will find TSYS employees entertaining customers and potential customers constantly. I cannot go to Publix after work to get groceries without running into half of TSYS, it feels like. I just say that, and I just, like I said, this is a very non-technical thing, but I say this to make sure that we don't get lost in the numbers so much that we forget about the people and the broader implications of the investment in this community and in the state of Georgia of what that R&D tax credit means. And it means the people at the company that I work with and the folks in this community who benefit from this company being located here in Georgia and in Columbus, Georgia. And thank you so much again for allowing us to come here and speak.
Thank you, Darren. And again, I'll ask the panel if you guys have any questions related to these tax credits and their impact on industry, especially here in the Columbus region.
Well, it's all quiet. I know we apologize for it being and running so late. I thank you, gentlemen, for waiting and going late for us here today. We had a lot of information we're trying to pack into one meeting, elements of two meetings into one. So thank y'all all very much. Are there still no questions? Nobody had anything come to mind?
One of the things that I've wanted to ask everybody is if there's anything when the tax credits come up for reevaluation when it sunsets, if there's anything in the, say, the R&D tax credit that needs to be tweaked or improved, what would it be?
I believe the Georgia Chamber has some recommendations along that line, so I'd probably defer to them for the recommendations that they have in there. I think there's some tweaks that they are looking at in that thing. My point is just to emphasize how important it is to us competitively, and that it has been important to us.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I do know that the Georgia Chamber is working through that as well. And one of the things I do want to highlight is what Darren spoke to, and Dr. George also, but there is that trickle-down impact that also has a significant influence on the success of small business. All the businesses that Darren mentioned are small businesses that thrive in Columbus. So again, I don't want to lose that in this conversation.
I would just add one thing to that as far as tweaking any of these programs. One thing you can do with tax credits is pass them up to parent organizations and not actually reinvest them in the community. But like you heard us talking about here, they're having a direct impact on the community. They're not just being passed along to some home base operation. But that's something to keep an eye on, because sometimes you're putting the tax incentive in there to be reinvested in the community, and if they're just passing it out as dividends to shareholders, that's not accomplishing your goal. So be wary of that.
Dr. George, would you answer one other question? Just your presentation kind of brought up. If we're looking at, we hear a lot about, competitiveness and with other states and what other states are offering. We also hear a lot about return on investment. Do you weight one versus the other? Is there a balance? What is it, certain credits look at one versus the other more heavily? What do you have a recommendation?
So without speaking directly to any particular tax credit, without doing a full deep dive into those and the costs and benefits associated with them, I would suggest that in terms of competitiveness, you need to, we're in the top 3 in our region in corporate tax rates. And, dropping those down to 4 3/4 would attract all businesses, not just certain businesses. So think of it that way. Tax credits are targeted at things that you really want to encourage, like research and development, or things that you want to encourage, like low-income housing. Whatever those priorities are, that's what you target with those. But really the larger problems I was speaking to is an across-the-board problem, and that's where the rate in general coming down is more competitive and more attractive to external businesses. When those businesses come into Georgia, they bring the workers, they pay their sales tax, which is, 60% of your tax revenue. They pay their sales taxes, they pay their income taxes, which is another 20-30% of your tax take, and property taxes for local communities. That's what you really have to consider is how do we get businesses moving here, bringing in the demographics that we need to grow the state, and then use your tax credits to target specific areas that are either underrepresented or by the market or need additional boosts to get to the optimal level.
And if I could follow up with a question, you talked about the other states. North Carolina is probably concerning to me because not only the corporate income tax you talked about, but their personal income tax rate has dropped. Used to be higher than us, now lower than us, and they're out there advertising that heavily.
Yeah. I would consider them our biggest competitor in the Southeast. They're very similar to Georgia, and I think people are flipping a coin many times between North Carolina and Georgia, and one of those variables that they're going to consider is the corporate tax rate and the personal income tax rate, although it's not horrible there.
Well, I know we're only 45 minutes over. I thank everybody for their patience. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Columbus State University. Dr. George, the panelists, I appreciate Global Payments and Synovus loaning y'all to us today. And it's really good to hear the discussions, and we look forward to further discussions at a later date. Thank you all, panelists. Safe travels, everyone. We're adjourned.